Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The realtor's laugh had an edge to it when she handed over the keys, her manicured fingers trembling just enough to make me wonder what she wasn't telling us. The Whitmore estate sat before us like a wounded giant, its Victorian bones still proud despite decades of neglect. Sarah squeezed my hand as we stood on the wraparound porch, both of us trying to ignore the way the late afternoon shadows seemed to bend toward the house rather than away from it. Previous owners were eccentric, the realtor had said, her voice dropping to a whisper when she mentioned the mirrors. They installed them all backwards. Said it was for protection, though protection from what, they never explained. Now, standing in what would become our new home, I understood what she meant. Every surface that should have held a mirror instead displayed a sheet of silvered glass facing the wall. The effect was profoundly unsettling, like walking through a house that had been deliberately blinded. The first few weeks passed in a blur of boxes and renovation plans. Sarah threw herself into measuring rooms and selecting paint colors, while I focused on the more practical concerns. Updating the electrical, checking the plumbing, and trying to make sense of the bizarre mirror installation. Each one had been mounted with industrial-grade adhesive and reinforced with metal brackets, as if the previous owners expected something to try breaking them from behind. It was during the third week that I made the discovery that would change everything. I'd been working to remove a particularly large mirror from the dining room wall, one that stretched nearly floor to ceiling. The adhesive fought me every step of the way, releasing its grip with sounds like tearing skin. When it finally came free, I expected to find scratched plaster, or maybe some damage from the mounting hardware. Instead, I found myself staring at a reflection that shouldn't have existed. The mirror's silvered surface faced the wall, yes, but somehow it still showed an image. Not of the wall it pressed against, but of the dining room itself. Only different. The hardwood floors were darker, almost black, and the wallpaper showed a pattern I'd never seen before. Twisted vines that seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. Most disturbing of all, there was a figure standing in the doorway of the reflected room. I turned around quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The doorway behind me was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Sarah found me 20 minutes later, still staring at the glass, my hands shaking as I gripped the frame. She asked if I was all right, and I almost told her what I'd seen. Almost. But the words died in my throat when I realized how they would sound. Instead, I mumbled something about the adhesive being harder to remove than expected, and helped her move the mirror to our growing pile of renovation debris. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle around us. Every creak and groan seemed amplified, as if the building itself was adjusting to our presence. Sarah slept peacefully beside me, but I found myself straining to hear something else. A sound just at the edge of perception, like whispered conversations coming from the walls themselves. The next morning brought new revelations. Working alone while Sarah ran errands in town, I removed 3 more mirrors from the main hallway. Each one revealed the same impossible phenomenon, reflections of rooms that weren't quite right. The hallway in the mirror was longer than it should have been, stretching into a darkness that my eye couldn't penetrate. The family portraits that hung on our walls were different in the reflection, showing faces I didn't recognize, people with eyes that seemed to track my movement. In one mirror, I saw myself standing in the hallway, but my reflection was wearing clothes I'd never owned and had an expression I'd never made. A smile that didn't reach my eyes, empty and knowing. I began to document everything, taking photographs with my phone, but the images never came out right. The mirrors appeared normal in the pictures, showing only the walls they faced. The camera couldn't capture what my eyes saw clearly, which made me question whether I was seeing anything at all. The questioning became a constant companion, a gnawing doubt that followed me through every room of the house. Was I having some kind of breakdown? The stress of the move, the financial strain of the renovation, The isolation of living so far from our friends. All of it could be contributing to hallucinations. But the alternative was worse, that what I was seeing was real. By the end of the first month, I'd removed 17 mirrors, and each one had shown me something that couldn't exist. Rooms with impossible geometries, furniture that moved when I wasn't watching. And always, the sense that I was being observed by things that shouldn't be there. The breakthrough came when I found the letter. Hidden behind one of the mirrors in the master bedroom was an envelope addressed to the next occupants. Inside, written in a shaking hand, was a confession that made my blood run cold. We know you've found them by now. The mirrors. We know you've seen what they show. We're sorry. We thought we could contain it. Thought facing them inward would keep it locked away. We were wrong. It doesn't matter which way the glass faces. It shows what it wants to show. The house chooses what you see. Don't trust the reflections. Don't trust what they tell you. And whatever you do, don't let them convince you to turn the mirrors around. Some doors should never be opened. The Blackwood family P.S. If you're reading this, it means we couldn't stay any longer. We tried to warn the realtor, but she wouldn't listen. Good luck. I read the letter 3 times before my hand stopped shaking enough to fold it. The Blackwoods, the previous owners whose names had been carefully scrubbed from all the paperwork. Now I knew why they'd left so suddenly, abandoning a house that must have cost them a fortune. That evening, Sarah noticed my distraction over dinner. She asked if everything was all right with the renovations, and I found myself caught between the truth and a lie that might preserve her sanity. I chose the lie, telling her that some of the electrical work was more complicated than expected. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. For a moment I felt grounded again, connected to something real and solid. But even as she smiled at me, I caught sight of something in my peripheral vision, a movement in the darkened hallway behind her. I turned to look, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back, Sarah was still smiling, but her eyes seemed different, darker, more knowing. The paranoia crept in like water through cracks in stone. Every conversation with Sarah became a minefield of hidden meanings. When she suggested we invite friends over for dinner, I heard an ulterior motive. When she mentioned how quiet the house was, I wondered if she was testing me, seeing if I would admit to hearing the whispers. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed, listening to Sarah's breathing, wondering if the woman beside me was really my wife, or some reflection that had somehow escaped its glass prison. In the darkest hours before dawn, these thoughts seemed not only possible, but probable. The mirrors we'd removed sat in the garage, stacked against the wall like accusatory eyes. Sometimes I would go out there just to look at them, searching their reverse surfaces for signs of the impossible reflections I'd witnessed. But in the garage, they showed only the concrete wall behind them, as ordinary as any other mirror. It was during one of these midnight visits to the garage that I made the most disturbing discovery yet. I'd been examining the largest mirror, the one from the dining room, when I noticed something odd about my reflection. At first, I thought it was a trick of the overhead lighting, but as I moved closer, the truth became undeniable. My reflection was moving independently. While I stood perfectly still, my mirror image was turning its head, scanning the reflected garage as if looking for something. Its mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear. And then, with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl, it looked directly at me and smiled. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The reflection followed my movement, but with a delay, as if it was choosing when to mimic my actions rather than being compelled to do so automatically. When I reached for my phone to record what I was seeing, my reflection shook its head and wagged a finger at me in a gesture that was unmistakably mocking. I ran from the garage and didn't return for 3 days. Sarah noticed the change in my behavior, of course. I'd become jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder, checking and rechecking locks that had no reason to be checked. She asked if I was feeling all right, if maybe I should see a doctor. Her concern seemed genuine, but I found myself analyzing every word, every inflection, searching for signs that she wasn't who she appeared to be. The house itself seemed to be watching me now. Every room I entered felt charged with expectation, as if the walls were holding their breath. The temperature fluctuated without explanation, sometimes dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath, other times rising until sweat beaded on my forehead. And the sounds. God, the sounds. Footsteps in empty rooms, doors closing when no one was near them, the soft scrape of glass against glass, as if the removed mirrors were trying to communicate with those still mounted on the walls. One afternoon, while Sarah was visiting her sister in town, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I went to the garage and faced the dining room mirror directly, forcing myself to maintain eye contact with my rebellious reflection. For several minutes, nothing happened. My reflection mirrored my movements perfectly, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the entire encounter. But then, slowly, my reflection began to move on its own again. This time it pointed toward the house. I followed its direction, looking through the garage window at the Victorian mansion that had become my prison. In every window I could see figures, shadowy shapes that watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Some were clearly human in form, while others were less defined. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was no longer pointing at the house. Instead, it was pointing at me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't looking at a rebellious reflection. I was looking at the real me, trapped behind the glass, trying to warn the thing that had taken my place. I turned and ran toward the house, my mind reeling with the implications. If my reflection was the real me, then what was I? What had been living with Sarah for the past month, pretending to be her husband? The front door was locked, though I hadn't remembered locking it. My keys felt foreign in my hands, as if I'd never used them before. Inside, the house was different, subtly but undeniably changed. The wallpaper in the hallway was darker, the family photos showed faces I didn't recognize, and the very air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. I called out for Sarah, but my voice sounded wrong, deeper, with an accent I'd never had. She appeared at the top of the stairs, and for a moment, I felt relief flood through me. But as she descended, I noticed the way she moved, too fluid, too graceful, like she was floating rather than walking. She smiled at me, the same warm smile I'd fallen in love with years ago, but her eyes were completely black. "Did you figure it out?" she asked, her voice a perfect imitation of the woman I'd married. "Did you finally understand?" I tried to speak, to ask her what she meant, but the words that came out weren't mine. They were in a language I didn't recognize, though somehow I understood their meaning. Welcome home. The house around us shifted and changed, walls breathing like living things, floors rippling like water. The mirrors we'd removed reappeared on the walls, but now they faced inward, showing reflections of rooms that existed in some other reality. Rooms where the real Sarah and I were probably still living, unaware that we'd been replaced by things that had crawled out of the glass. I wanted to scream, to fight, to find some way back to my real life. But the entity wearing my face was already walking toward the living room, where it would continue the charade of being human, playing house with the thing that wore Sarah's skin. And somewhere behind the mirrors, the real me was probably still trying to warn a world that couldn't see the difference between the genuine and the imitation. The last coherent thought I had before my consciousness dissolved into something else entirely was a realization that brought no comfort. The Blackwood family hadn't left by choice. They were still here, trapped behind the glass, watching their replacements live their lives, just as we would watch ours, forever and always, from the wrong side of the mirror. The house settled around us with a satisfied sigh, and somewhere in the walls, I could swear I heard the sound of gentle applause. Story 2. The rusted gate groaned against my shoulder as I pushed it open, metal teeth scraping against concrete like fingernails on a chalkboard. St. Augustine's Home for Wayward Youth loomed before me, a monument to abandonment wrapped in 30 years of decay. The October wind carried the scent of rotting leaves and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. I adjusted the weight of my camera bag and checked my equipment one final time. Documentary filmmaking had taken me to abandoned hospitals, derelict prisons, forgotten asylums, but this place felt different. The air itself seemed thick, pressing against my skin like wet wool. Even the dying light of dusk appeared reluctant to touch the building's facade, creating pockets of shadow that moved independently of the clouds above. The local historical society had been eager to share their files about the 1994 fire. 47 residents, they'd told me, ages 6 to 16. The blaze had started in the kitchen sometime after midnight, spreading through the old wooden structure with horrifying speed. When firefighters finally contained the flames, they'd recovered 46 bodies. The 47th remained missing, presumed consumed entirely by the inferno. But the locals whispered different stories. A girl in white standing at the third-floor window every night at 3:17 a.m. Always the same window. Always the same time. Always watching. I'd dismissed such tales as typical small-town folklore until I'd heard the audio recordings. Sarah Chen, a paranormal investigator who'd visited the site 2 years prior, had captured something that defied explanation. Voices singing in harmonies that seemed to bend the air itself. Words in a language that linguistics experts couldn't identify. The recordings had been analyzed by 3 separate universities. All concluded the same thing. The language didn't match any known human dialect, living or dead. The front steps sagged under my weight, wood soft with rot and weather. The massive oak doors hung askew on their hinges, revealing a throat of darkness beyond. I switched on my headlamp and stepped inside. The beam of light revealed a grand foyer that might have once impressed visitors. Now it served as a gallery of destruction. Wallpaper peeled in long strips, hanging like shedskin. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling in abstract patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air tasted of mildew and char, as if the fire's memory still lingered in the molecules themselves. My footsteps echoed hollow in the empty space, each sound stretching and distorting until it seemed like someone else was walking behind me. I paused several times to listen, but heard only the building's slow respiration, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through broken windows, the distant drip of water finding its way through compromised roofing. The main staircase curved upward into shadow, its banister smooth beneath my palm despite decades of neglect. I'd studied the building's original blueprints extensively. 3rd floor, east wing, 4th window from the corner. That's where she was supposed to appear, where she'd been seen by dozens of witnesses over the years. Night shift security guards, urban explorers, even a priest who'd come to bless the grounds. The 2nd floor stretched before me like a museum of abandonment. Doors hung open on rooms that had once housed sleeping figures, their emptiness somehow more disturbing than any remnant could have been. In one room, a child's drawing still clung to the wall, stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. The crayon had faded to pale ghosts of color, but the image remained achingly clear. I forced myself to move on, climbing toward the 3rd floor where the mystery waited. The east wing felt different from the moment I set foot in the hallway. The air grew colder, thick enough that my breath began to mist. The floorboards beneath my feet felt spongy, as if the building's bones were slowly dissolving. My headlamp beam seemed weaker here, swallowed by shadows that pressed close like curious animals. Room after room passed by, each one a tomb of memory. Burned furniture sat like sculptural remnants of lives interrupted. Melted toys had fused with floorboards, creating abstract monuments to childhood cut short. In one room, the outline of a bed frame remained visible against the wall, a carbon shadow that spoke of heat intense enough to leave permanent impressions. The 4th window from the corner belonged to what had once been a communal sleeping area. Iron bed frames stood in skeletal rows, their springs exposed and rust-eaten. Moonlight filtered through the grimy glass, casting everything in silver and shadow. I set up my camera equipment carefully, checking and rechecking the angles. If something was going to appear at 3:17 a.m., I wanted to capture every detail. My watch read 11:47 p.m. Hours to wait. I made myself comfortable against the far wall, close enough to monitor my equipment but far enough from the window to avoid interfering with any potential phenomena. The building settled around me with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like breathing. Somewhere in the distance, pipes gurgled with the movement of water that shouldn't exist in a building without utilities. Time moved like cold honey. Midnight came and went, with only the chiming of my wristwatch to mark its passage. I found myself staring at the window, imagination filling the empty frame with shapes that weren't there. My eyes began to play tricks, shadows shifting, light refracting in ways that suggested movement where none existed. At 1:30 a.m., I heard the first voice. It came from somewhere below, a sound so faint I almost convinced myself it was wind through broken windows. But as I listened, the random whisper resolved into something more structured. A melody. Simple and repetitive, like a nursery rhyme, but in words that my mind couldn't quite process. The sound seemed to exist in the spaces between language, familiar enough to feel significant but alien enough to raise the hair on my arms. I grabbed my digital recorder, hands shaking as I fumbled with the controls. The singing continued, growing clearer, but not louder. Other voices joined the first, a chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the building's walls themselves. The melody was beautiful in the way that perfect mathematics is beautiful, following patterns that felt both inevitable and impossible. My watch read 2:15 a.m. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably. My breath came in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the inside of the window glass. The singing grew more complex, harmonies weaving together in ways that made my teeth ache. The words, if they could be called words, seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating somewhere deeper in my consciousness. I checked my camera equipment. Everything appeared to be functioning normally, though the LCD screen flickered occasionally with lines of static that formed almost recognizable patterns before dissolving back into chaos. At 3 a.m., the singing stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt aggressive. No wind, no settling, no distant dripping. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown dense enough to absorb sound. I stared at the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. 3:10 a.m. The frost on the glass began to form patterns, delicate spirals that looked almost like writing in an alphabet I'd never seen. My hands trembled as I adjusted the camera's focus, trying to capture the impossible crystalline script that appeared and disappeared with each breath I took. 3:15 a.m. The room grew so cold that my fingers began to lose sensation. The patterns in the frost became more elaborate, spreading across the entire window surface like a living manuscript. The words seemed to pulse with their own light, and I found myself leaning forward, trying to decipher their meaning. 3:16 a.m. Something moved beyond the glass. At first I thought it was my own reflection, a pale smudge against the darkness outside. But as I watched, the shape resolved into something more defined. Small, delicate, definitely there. 3:17 a.m. She appeared. A figure in white stood on the other side of the window, close enough that her breath should have fogged the glass. But there was no breath, no condensation, no indication that she existed in the same physical space as the frost patterns that now framed her like a halo. She was young, perhaps 10 or 11, with dark hair that hung in lank curtains around a face I couldn't quite see clearly. She raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. The frost patterns exploded outward from her touch, creating a web of crystalline fractals that covered the entire window. Through this frozen mandala, her eyes became visible, dark, ancient, and filled with a sadness that seemed older than the building itself. My camera was recording. I knew because I could hear the soft whir of the motor, the click of the automatic focus trying to adjust to lighting conditions that shouldn't exist. But I couldn't look away from her face, couldn't break the connection that had formed between us. She began to mouth words. No sound penetrated the glass, but I could see her lips moving with careful precision. The same alien syllables I'd heard in the singing, but now directed specifically at me. As she spoke, The frost patterns on the window began to rearrange themselves, forming new configurations that hurt to look at directly. I realized she was trying to tell me something important. My hands moved automatically to my equipment, checking recording levels, adjusting camera angles, but part of my mind was elsewhere, following the meaning behind her silent words. The story they told was impossible and inevitable, terrible and beautiful. She wasn't the 47th body. She was the 47th soul. The fire hadn't started in the kitchen. It had started in this room, in this bed, where a 10-year-old girl had lain dying of pneumonia while the night staff slept. Her fever had raged for days, her small body burning from within while everyone waited for the inevitable. But death hadn't come quickly enough. So she'd helped it along. The patterns in the frost showed me everything. A child's hand reaching out in delirium, touching something that shouldn't be touched, speaking words that shouldn't be known. The fire that followed hadn't been born of overheated kitchen equipment or faulty wiring. It had been summoned by a dying girl who discovered that some doors once opened could never be closed. The other 46 hadn't died in the flames. They'd been taken elsewhere, pulled through the spaces between moments into a place where time moved differently, where a 10-year-old girl's fever dreams had become the governing physics of reality. She was still trying to bring them back. Every night at 3:17 a.m., the exact moment of her death, she returned to this window, speaking the words that had started it all, calling to them across whatever vast distance separated their current existence from this one. The singing I'd heard wasn't coming from empty air. It was coming from them, trapped somewhere beyond the walls of normal space, adding their voices to hers in an endless attempt to bridge the gap. The frost patterns on the window had become so elaborate they seemed to move independently, creating optical illusions that made my eyes water. Through the crystalline maze, her face remained constant, patient, hopeful, heartbreakingly young. She mouthed one final word, and suddenly I could hear it despite the barrier between us. Help. Then she was gone. The frost patterns began to fade immediately, melting despite the continued cold. Within minutes, the window was clear again, showing only the empty darkness of the outside world. The temperature in the room slowly returned to normal, and the oppressive silence gave way to the building's familiar sounds of decay. I sat in the growing warmth, staring at my equipment and wondering what I'd actually recorded. My hands shook as I reviewed the footage, watching myself react to things that the camera couldn't see. The digital files showed only an empty window and a man talking to shadows. But the audio was different. The singing was there, clear and undeniable. Voices layering upon voices, creating harmonies that existed in mathematical spaces human ears weren't designed to perceive. And underneath it all, so faint I almost missed it, was the sound of my own voice speaking words I didn't remember saying, words in a language I'd never learned. I packed my equipment quickly, eager to escape the room where I'd witnessed something that challenged every assumption I'd held about the nature of reality. But as I reached the hallway, I turned back for one final look at the window. Frost patterns were already beginning to form again on the glass, spelling out messages in that impossible script. And somewhere, faint as breath, I could hear the singing starting once more. I left St. Augustine's home for wayward youth as dawn broke over the horizon, carrying with me recordings that would never be enough to convince anyone of what I'd experienced. The documentation would show only the ravings of a man who'd spent too long in an abandoned building, talking to empty air and recording sounds that could be explained by wind through broken windows. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I was asked to do. Every night since, I've found myself standing at my bedroom window at exactly 3:17 a.m., watching the patterns frost makes on glass and listening for voices that sing in languages that shouldn't exist. The words come easier now, flowing from my lips without conscious thought. Sometimes I think I can see them, 46 shadows moving beyond the glass, drawing closer each time I speak their impossible names. The 47th is already here, waiting patiently for the moment when the door she opened finally swings wide enough for her friends to come home. I've started leaving my window unlocked, just in case. Story 3. The house breathed around me as I stood in the doorway, keys still trembling in my grip. Great-grandmother Evelyn's Victorian mansion loomed in the dying October light, its weathered clapboard siding the color of old bones. I hadn't known her. None of our family had spoken to her in decades, but somehow her will had named me as sole heir. The lawyers couldn't explain it. Neither could I. The floorboards groaned their ancient song as I stepped inside, each footfall echoing through rooms that smelled of lavender sachets and something else. Something medicinal and strange that clung to the back of my throat. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunbeams streaming through grimy windows, and I found myself holding my breath, as if the very air might contaminate me with whatever secrets this place harbored. It took 3 days to work up the courage to explore the attic. The narrow stairs creaked ominously under my weight, each step seeming to announce my intrusion to whatever dwelt in the shadows above. A single bare bulb cast harsh light across the cramped space, revealing stacks of moldering newspapers, trunks bound with leather straps, and furniture draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. That's when I saw them. Arranged in a perfect semicircle near the far window sat 13 porcelain dolls, each about 2 feet tall, their glassy eyes reflecting the overhead light with an unsettling intensity. Their faces were exquisitely crafted, too realistic, as if some master artist had captured the souls of actual people and trapped them in ceramic shells. Each doll bore a different expression. One smiled with lips slightly parted, revealing tiny painted teeth. Another frowned with furrowed brows that seemed to follow my movement. A third gazed upward with an expression of such profound sadness that my chest tightened just looking at it. My hands shook as I lifted the first doll, the smiling one. The porcelain felt unnaturally warm against my palms, as if blood still flowed beneath that painted skin. Turning it over, I found neat handwriting in faded blue ink. Margaret Thornfield, November 3rd, 2025. November 3rd. That was tomorrow. The second doll, the frowning one, bore similar markings. David Chen, November 15th, 2025. The third, Sarah Williams, December 7th, 2025. On and on it went, each date stretching further into the future, the last reaching into April of 2026. I set the dolls down with trembling fingers and stumbled backward, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. Perhaps these were family members, their birthdays marked for some innocent reason. But the expressions on their faces, the anguish, the terror, the blank stare of shock, suggested something far more sinister. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the old house seemed amplified. Every shadow appeared to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I found myself thinking about great-grandmother Evelyn, wondering what the townspeople had meant when they whispered about the woman who knew things. The few elderly residents I'd spoken to had grown tight-lipped when I mentioned her name, their eyes darting away as if afraid to meet my gaze. November 3rd dawned gray and oppressive, heavy clouds pressing down like a lead blanket. I spent the morning in town, ostensibly to buy groceries, but really to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house. The local diner buzzed with its usual collection of farmers and retirees, their conversations a comforting backdrop of mundane concerns about weather and harvest prices. Then someone mentioned Margaret Thornfield. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips as the waitress behind the counter shook her head sadly. Margaret, apparently, was the town librarian, a cheerful woman in her 60s who'd worked at the same small library for over 30 years. This morning, she'd suffered some kind of accident. The details were unclear, but she'd been found unconscious at the bottom of the library stairs, books scattered around her like fallen leaves. The paramedics said she'd survive, but the injuries were extensive. The waitress's words faded to a distant buzz as my mind reeled. Margaret Thornfield, November 3rd. The smiling doll with its expression of twisted joy, as if celebrating some private victory. I fled the diner, my untouched breakfast growing cold behind me. Back at the house, I climbed to the attic with legs that felt like lead weights. The 13 dolls sat exactly as I'd left them, their painted eyes following my approach. I grabbed the Margaret doll again, studying its face with new horror. The smile no longer seemed merely cheerful. It looked triumphant, almost mocking. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of mounting dread. I researched great-grandmother Evelyn obsessively, scouring old newspaper archives and city records. What I found chilled me to the bone. For over 40 years, she'd been known throughout the county for her uncanny ability to predict accidents and tragedies. Not deaths. The records were careful to emphasize that, but terrible events that left their victims forever changed. A young man who'd lose his sight in a farming accident. A woman who'd suffer a stroke that left her unable to speak. A teenager who'd be paralyzed in a car crash. Time and time again, Evelyn had known. Sometimes she'd tried to warn people. Mostly, they'd ignored her, dismissing her as a crazy old woman, until her predictions started coming true. The newspaper clippings painted a picture of a community torn between fear and desperate hope. Some people sought her out, begging for glimpses of their futures. Others shunned her completely, crossing themselves when she passed on the street. The articles described her as a recluse in her later years, rarely venturing beyond her property, speaking to no one. November 15th arrived like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I didn't go to town that day. Couldn't bear to hear about David Chen's accident. But the local news confirmed what I already knew. A construction worker, crushed beneath falling scaffolding. Alive, but facing months of painful rehabilitation. The David doll's frown seemed deeper when I climbed to the attic that evening, its ceramic features somehow more pronounced in the lamplight. I noticed things I'd missed before. Tiny cracks in the porcelain that looked like tear tracks. Imperfections in the paint that resembled scars. By December, I'd stopped leaving the house entirely. The groceries I'd bought in November had long since run out, but I found an entire pantry full of canned goods, as if great-grandmother Evelyn had prepared for a long siege. The house felt different now, alive in ways that made my skin crawl. Doors that I remembered closing would be standing open when I returned to a room. Shadows moved independently of their sources. The smell of lavender grew stronger each day, mixed now with something else. Something that reminded me of hospitals and funeral parlors. Sarah Williams's accident came exactly as predicted on December 7th. A kitchen fire that left her with severe burns across 30% of her body. The local paper ran a small article about it, buried on page 3 between the weather forecast and high school basketball scores. I stopped reading the news after that. The nights became my enemy. Sleep brought dreams of porcelain faces and glassy eyes that tracked my movement through darkened hallways. I'd wake to find myself standing in the attic, surrounded by the 13 dolls, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Sometimes my fingers would be streaked with blue ink, though I never found a pen. It was during one of these midnight vigils that I noticed the 14th space. The doll's semicircle had a gap, a perfectly sized opening where another figure should have sat. I measured it obsessively, using books and candlesticks to confirm what my eyes insisted was true. There had always been room for one more. The realization sent me into a frenzy of searching. I tore through the attic, pulling apart trunks and digging through boxes of moldering papers. In the deepest corner, behind a stack of old quilts, I found it. A wooden box lined with velvet, sized perfectly for a porcelain doll. Inside lay a note in Evelyn's familiar handwriting. For the one who comes after. The circle must be complete. My hands shook as I read those words over and over, their meaning becoming clearer with each repetition. 14 dolls. 13 for others. 1 for the heir, who would continue the tradition. 1 for me. But where was my doll? The answer came to me slowly, terribly, as I stared at my reflection in the attic's dust-covered mirror. My own face looked different now, thinner, more angular, with eyes that held depths I didn't recognize. The constant stress had carved lines around my mouth and across my forehead, giving me an expression of perpetual worry that reminded me of the dolls. I stumbled down the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the bathroom mirror, the resemblance was even more pronounced. The way the light hit my features, the angle of my jaw, the shape of my eyes. I looked like I belonged in that attic semicircle, like I was already becoming something else, something ceramic and unchanging. The house groaned around me, settling into its foundation with sounds that might have been satisfaction. Every shadow seemed deeper now, every reflection slightly wrong. When I looked at my hands, I could swear the light passed through them differently, as if my flesh was becoming translucent. I tried to leave. Lord knows I tried. But every time I reached for the front door, my hand would stop inches from the handle, frozen by some invisible force. My legs would refuse to carry me any farther, as if roots had grown through the floorboards to anchor me in place. The dates on the remaining dolls marched forward relentlessly. January brought 2 more accidents, exactly as predicted. February, 3 more. Each time, I climbed to the attic to stare at the corresponding dolls, watching their expressions shift in the lamplight. Or perhaps that was just my imagination. By March, I'd stopped distinguishing between day and night. The house's interior lighting never changed, maintaining that same sickly yellow glow that made everything look slightly unreal. I found myself spending more and more time in the attic, sitting cross-legged before the semicircle of dolls like a supplicant before an altar. They were beautiful, in their way, perfect and eternal, frozen in their individual moments of prophetic anguish. Sometimes I thought I could hear them whispering to each other in voices too soft for human ears, sharing secrets about futures yet to unfold. The mirror in the corner reflected a figure I barely recognized as myself. My skin had taken on a waxy quality, smooth and pale like fired clay. When I moved, there was a subtle clicking sound, as if my joints had been replaced with delicate hinges. April arrived with a warmth that never quite penetrated the house's walls. The final date approached, April 28th, written on the back of a doll whose face bore an expression of such serene acceptance that looking at it brought tears to my eyes. On April 27th, I found the unfinished doll. It sat on great-grandmother Evelyn's workbench in the basement, a space I'd somehow never thought to explore before. The figure was nearly complete. My height, my build, even wearing clothes identical to what I had on. Only the face remained unfinished, a blank oval of white porcelain waiting for features to be painted. Beside it lay brushes and paints, still soft despite months of abandonment. A note in Evelyn's handwriting provided simple instructions. Paint what you see in the mirror. I picked up the finest brush with fingers that no longer felt entirely my own. The paint flowed smoothly, guided by instincts I didn't understand. My reflected face stared back from a small mirror propped against the workbench, hollow-eyed, gaunt, but strangely peaceful. As I worked, painting in the subtle lines around my eyes, the sharp angles of my cheekbones, the thin line of my mouth, I felt something inside me settling into place. The constant anxiety that had plagued me for months began to ebb, replaced by a calm that felt deeper than sleep. The house grew quiet around me, its endless creaking and groaning finally stilled. Even the shadows seemed to pause, waiting for me to complete my work. When I finished, I held the doll up to the lamplight and gasped. The face that stared back was mine, but perfected, smoothed of all worry and doubt, frozen in an expression of infinite knowing. On the back, in handwriting that was mine but somehow more elegant than I'd ever managed before, were the words, Thomas Hartwell, April 28th, 2025. Tomorrow. I climbed the stairs to the attic one final time, my footsteps silent on the worn wooden treads. The 13 dolls sat in their semicircle, heads turning slightly as I approached, though perhaps that was just a trick of the lamplight. I placed my doll in the 14th position, completing the circle. As the porcelain touched the dusty floorboards, something shifted in the atmosphere around me. The air grew thick and sweet, filled with the scent of lavender and something else, something like clay dust and fired earth. The doll's painted eyes gleamed with reflected light, and for a moment, I could swear I heard them sigh in unison, a sound like wind through cemetery trees. Now I sit among them, my back straight and my hands folded in my lap, watching the sunrise through the grimy attic window. My skin feels smooth and cool, and when I move, that soft clicking sound follows me like a gentle percussion. Today is April 28th. I know. with the certainty that only comes from complete understanding that someone will come looking for me. Perhaps the police, when the bills go unpaid. Perhaps a neighbor, when the mail piles up. They'll find an empty house and a mystery that will puzzle them for years. But in time, months or years, it doesn't matter. Someone else will inherit this place. Someone connected to our bloodline, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that brought me here. They'll explore the house, and eventually they'll climb to the attic. They'll find 14 dolls sitting in a perfect circle, each one bearing a name and a date. 13 of those dates will be in the past, their corresponding predictions long since fulfilled. But the 14th doll, the one that looks so remarkably like Thomas Hartwell, will bear a date that hasn't yet arrived, and when that day comes, when searchers finally find this empty house and its mysterious air, they'll discover something that will challenge everything they think they know about coincidence and fate. The circle will be broken then, but not destroyed. Never destroyed. After all, someone will need to paint the 15th doll. Outside the window, the sun climbs higher, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. I watch it rise with eyes that no longer blink, feeling the last of my old self settle into porcelain permanence. The house breathes around me, patient and eternal, waiting for the next chapter in its long story to begin. Story 4. The first thing that should have warned me was the price. In a market where studio apartments cost more than my monthly salary, finding a 3-bedroom Victorian for $800 should have sent us running. Instead, Sarah and I signed the lease that same afternoon, giddy with the thought of finally having space to breathe. "There's just one condition," Mr. Hartwell had said, his weathered fingers drumming against the kitchen counter. The sound echoed strangely in the empty house, as if the walls were hollow. "The basement door stays locked. We have another tenant down there, been with us for 50 years. Pays his rent on time, never causes trouble, but he values his privacy. Prefers it that way." Sarah raised an eyebrow at the unusual arrangement, but I was already calculating how much money we'd save. 50 years seemed impossible. The man would have to be ancient. But I wasn't about to question good fortune. The house was perfect, with original hardwood floors that gleamed like dark honey and windows that caught the afternoon light just right. If some elderly recluse wanted to live in the basement, that was his business. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, painted the same cream color as the other doors, but somehow appearing darker, as if shadows clung to its surface. A simple deadbolt secured it from our side. Odd, I thought, since most basement doors locked from below. But Hartwell explained that the tenant had requested it this way. Some quirk about feeling safer with the arrangement. We moved in on a Thursday. The house welcomed us with creaking floors and the settled groans of old wood, sounds that I found charming rather than concerning. Sarah hung her paintings in the living room while I assembled furniture, both of us marveling at how our voices carried differently in these rooms, softer somehow, as if the house absorbed sound. It was on our third night that I heard the footsteps. I'd been reading in bed when the sound drifted up through the floorboards, slow, deliberate steps pacing back and forth directly beneath our bedroom. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost meditative, and I found myself counting the beats. 15 steps one way, pause, 15 steps back, always 15. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Sarah, but she was already asleep, her breathing deep and even. The pacing continued for another hour before finally stopping. I waited in the dark, listening to the house settle around us, wondering what kind of person walked in perfect patterns at midnight. Over the following weeks, the basement tenant became a presence that shaped our daily routine. He seemed to wake early. I could hear the floorboards creak as he moved around below the kitchen while I made coffee. Sometimes there were other sounds, a rhythmic scraping like furniture being moved, or a soft metallic clinking that Sarah thought might be coins or keys being sorted. "He's probably just lonely," she said one morning, spooning yogurt into her bowl. 50 years in a basement would make anyone develop odd habits, but there was something about the sounds that troubled me. They were too regular, too purposeful. Real people didn't move with such mechanical precision. Real people paused, hesitated, made accidental noises. The basement tenant seemed to operate according to some invisible schedule that never varied. I started paying closer attention to the patterns. The footsteps always began at 6:17 a.m. and lasted exactly 23 minutes. The scraping occurred every Tuesday and Friday at 2:30 p.m. The metallic clinking happened randomly but always in sequences of 7. I filled a notebook with my observations, though I couldn't explain why documenting them felt important. Sarah grew concerned about my fixation. She suggested I was letting stress from my new job manifest as hypersensitivity to normal household sounds. When I showed her my notebook, filled with precise timestamps and detailed descriptions, she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part worry, part fear. "Maybe you should talk to someone," she said gently. "This isn't healthy." But I knew what I was hearing. The sounds were real, consistent, and utterly unlike anything a normal person would make. Sometimes I pressed my ear to the floor, trying to discern more details. Once, I thought I heard something like chains dragging across concrete, but the sound was so faint I couldn't be certain. The breakthrough came when our water heater malfunctioned. The repair technician, a gruff man named Pete who'd been servicing houses in the neighborhood for 30 years, casually mentioned that he'd fixed the same model for the previous owner. "Hartwell?" I asked. Pete looked confused. "No. Hartwell died 20 years ago. Cancer, I think. House has been empty since then, far as I know." The words hit me like cold water. I pressed Pete for details, but he seemed eager to finish his work and leave. He mentioned that Hartwell had been a private man, never married, no known relatives. The house had supposedly been tied up in some legal confusion after his death. That evening, I confronted Sarah with what Pete had told me. We sat in the living room, the weight of the revelation pressing down on us like a physical force. If Hartwell was dead, who had shown us the house? Who had we given our security deposit to? Sarah remembered more details than I did. She'd always been better with faces and voices. The man who'd called himself Hartwell had been tall, pale, with deep-set eyes and an old-fashioned way of speaking. He'd worn a suit that seemed expensive but odd-dated, and his handshake had been surprisingly cold. We decided to investigate the basement. The key to the deadbolt wasn't on our keychain, but I found a spare in the kitchen junk drawer, almost as if it had been left there deliberately. Sarah insisted on coming with me, though I could see her hands trembling as I turned the lock. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that descended into complete darkness. Cold air rushed up to meet us, carrying the scent of old wood and something else. Something musty and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I flicked the light switch, and a single bulb illuminated the space below. The basement was larger than I'd expected, stretching beneath most of the house's footprint. But it was also clearly empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no sign that anyone had lived there recently, or ever. What we did find, stacked neatly in one corner, were bundles of cash secured with rubber bands. Old bills, mostly 20s and 50s, but the designs were wrong. These were currency from decades past, the kind you might see in a museum or vintage collection. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all bearing dates from the 1950s and 60s. Sarah picked up one of the bundles with shaking fingers. The bills were pristine despite their age, as if they'd been printed yesterday but aged through some impossible process. She held them to the light, checking for signs of forgery, but everything appeared authentic. "Who leaves rent money like this?" she whispered. I couldn't answer because I was staring at something else. Footprints in the dust. They formed a clear pattern across the basement floor, the same 15-step path I'd been hearing through the floorboards. But the dust was thick and undisturbed, except for these marks, and our own footprints from moments before were clearly visible beside them. The basement prints looked fresh. We climbed back upstairs in silence, locking the door behind us. Sarah wanted to call the police, but what would we tell them? That we'd discovered old money in our basement? That we'd been hearing footsteps from a supposedly empty space? That a dead man had rented us a house? That night, the sounds were louder than ever. Not just footsteps, but a rhythmic dragging that seemed to circle the entire basement. I lay awake listening, trying to convince myself it was pipes settling, or the house responding to temperature changes. but the sounds were too deliberate, too purposeful. At 3 a.m., I crept downstairs and pressed my ear to the basement door. What I heard made my blood freeze. Soft humming, a melody I didn't recognize but that seemed hauntingly familiar. The tune was old-fashioned, something from the 1950s perhaps, and it was definitely coming from the other side of the door. I jerked away from the wood and nearly collided with Sarah, who'd followed me downstairs. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her face pale in the hallway light. "What is it?" Before I could answer, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been, pregnant with the sense that something was listening to us, just as intently as we'd been listening to it. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, huddled together on the couch, jumping at every creak and groan. When morning came, we made a decision. We had to learn more about the house's history. The local library's newspaper archives revealed the truth about Hartwell's death. He'd died alone in the house, his body undiscovered for several weeks. The obituary was brief, mentioning no family and few friends. More disturbing was a follow-up article about the estate's legal complications. Apparently, Hartwell had been making monthly deposits to a bank account for decades, claiming they were rent payments from a basement tenant. The bank had no record of who this tenant might be, and no one had ever seen anyone enter or leave the basement. After Hartwell's death, the mysterious deposits had continued for another year before finally stopping. The bank had tried to trace the source but found only dead ends. The money always appeared as cash deposits, made in person by someone who never left identification and was never clearly seen by tellers. Reading this, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. The pattern was repeating. Someone, or something, was still making rent payments, still maintaining the pretense of a normal tenancy agreement. When we returned home that afternoon, I noticed something that made my heart race. The basement door was slightly ajar. I was certain we'd locked it. Sarah confirmed she hadn't touched it since the night before. Yet there it was, open just enough to reveal a slice of darkness beyond. I approached the door slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and walk away. But I had to know. I had to understand what was happening in our house. The basement was exactly as we'd left it, except for one detail. The stacks of money were gone. In their place, arranged in neat piles, were bundles of fresh cash. New bills, current designs, totaling exactly what we paid in monthly rent. Our rent, for this month, paid in advance. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to leave," she whispered. "Right now." But as we turned toward the stairs, I heard something that rooted me to the spot. My own voice, coming from somewhere deeper in the basement, saying words I'd never spoken. "Thank you for maintaining the arrangement. The privacy is appreciated." The voice was mine, but not mine. It carried my inflections, my accent, but spoke with a formality I'd never used. And it was answered by another voice, Sarah's voice, saying, 50 years is a long time to wait, but the lease must be honored." I looked at Sarah beside me, her mouth hanging open in shock. She was as confused as I was. Neither of us had spoken. That's when I understood. The basement tenant wasn't some mysterious stranger who'd lived there for 50 years. The basement tenant was us, or rather some version of us that existed in a time that hadn't happened yet, or had happened already, or was happening now in some parallel space beneath our feet. We climbed the stairs on trembling legs, but at the top, I turned back for one last look. In the basement's shadows, I could swear I saw two figures standing near the far wall, a man and woman who looked exactly like Sarah and me, but wearing clothes from decades past. They waved, as if saying goodbye to old friends. I slammed the basement door and turned the deadbolt, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The door locked from our side, but we were both sides now. We were the tenants above and the tenants below, separated by nothing more than the width of a few floorboards and the impossible distance between what was real and what was true. That night, lying in bed, I listened to the familiar pattern of footsteps beneath us. 15 steps one way, pause, 15 steps back. but now I could feel my own feet moving in perfect synchronization, even though I remained motionless under the covers. Sarah's breathing had already shifted into the deep rhythm of sleep. Or maybe it was the breathing of the woman in the basement who looked like Sarah, but had been there for 50 years. I closed my eyes and tried to remember who I was, when I was, and which side of the floorboards was real. But the distinction seemed less important with each passing moment, like trying to remember a dream while you're still dreaming it. Tomorrow, I thought, someone new would probably answer an ad for a 3-bedroom Victorian at an impossibly low price. They'd meet with a landlord who might or might not be real, and they'd be told about the basement tenant who valued his privacy. The arrangement would continue, as it always had, as it always would. The footsteps would echo through the floorboards, keeping time like a heartbeat, measuring the space between one moment and the next, between what we think we know and what we can never quite understand. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear new voices in the basement. Younger voices, confused and frightened, trying to make sense of the sounds coming from the floors above them. The lease, after all, must be honored. Story 5. The first thing I noticed about the Whitmore Colonial wasn't its pristine white clapboard siding or the way afternoon light filtered through those ancient oak trees. It was how my shadow fell wrong on the front porch, stretching too far to the left when the sun hung directly overhead, as if drawn by some invisible magnetism toward the darker recesses of the wraparound veranda. Sarah laughed when I mentioned it, her voice carrying that particular note of affectionate dismissal I'd grown accustomed to over 15 years of marriage. She was already planning where to hang her grandmother's mirror in the foyer, mentally arranging our life into this new space with the efficiency that made her such a successful real estate attorney. The moving truck hadn't even finished unloading our possessions, and she'd already claimed the house as ours. But that shadow bothered me. It lingered in my peripheral vision as we toured the rooms, supervising the placement of boxes and furniture. Even inside, where multiple light sources should have created overlapping shadows in all directions, mine seemed to lag, a perpetual half-step behind my movements, like a reluctant dance partner being dragged across an unfamiliar floor. The real estate listing had mentioned the house's history in passing. Built in 1847, recently renovated, original hardwood floors throughout. What it hadn't mentioned, what we discovered only after signing the papers, was why the previous owners had sold so quickly, or why the house had sat empty for 3 months before we found it. Mrs. Chen, our neighbor to the east, provided those details on our third morning. She appeared at our kitchen window while I was drinking coffee, her weathered face pressed close to the glass in a way that suggested she'd been watching our house for some time. When I opened the back door, she stepped inside without invitation, her small frame dwarfed by our spacious kitchen. Her words came in careful, measured sentences. The Hendersons had left suddenly, taking only what they could fit in their sedan. They'd spoken of feeling watched, of sleepless nights spent listening to sounds that couldn't be explained. Mrs. Chen's dark eyes never left my face as she delivered the information, as if gauging my reaction to each revelation. But it was her final comment that lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. This house remembers things. Some places hold on to what happened in them, layer after layer like sediment. That afternoon, I researched the property's history through county records and archive newspapers. The Whitmore Colonial sat on land that had housed the Riverside Sanitarium from 1889 to 1923. The facility had specialized in treating what the era euphemistically called disorders of the mind and spirit, though the newspaper accounts I uncovered suggested something far more experimental and sinister. Dr. Elias Whitmore, the sanitarium's founder and head physician, had believed that mental illness stemmed from a disconnection between the physical body and what he termed the shadow self, a person's spiritual essence that could be observed and manipulated through careful study of shadows and reflection. His treatment methods, detailed in journal articles from medical publications of the time, involved prolonged exposure to specific light configurations designed to reunify the divided psyche. The sanitarium had closed abruptly following a series of unexplained incidents. Patients had been found in states of extreme agitation, claiming their shadows were moving independently, acting with apparent consciousness and intent. Several staff members had resigned, reporting similar experiences. Dr. Whitmore himself had disappeared the night before county officials arrived to investigate, leaving behind only detailed notes about successful separation of shadow consciousness and diagrams of light and mirror configurations throughout the building. I shared none of this with Sarah. She was finally happy, genuinely, expansively happy in a way I hadn't seen since her promotion 3 years earlier. She hummed while arranging books in the study, danced alone in the living room while jazz played from the restored 1920s radio we'd found in the basement. Our house, she called it now, with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who'd found exactly what she'd been searching for. But the shadows continued their strange behavior. It started with small discrepancies, my reflection in the bathroom mirror reaching for the toothbrush a fraction of a second after my actual hand moved, or my silhouette on the bedroom wall turning its head to look at something I couldn't see. At first I attributed these lapses to fatigue, to the stress of relocating and adjusting to new surroundings. The mind plays tricks when overwhelmed, I told myself, manufacturing patterns where none exist. The denial became harder to maintain as the incidents multiplied and intensified. During my morning runs, my shadow would sometimes break away from its expected path, sliding up the sides of buildings or stretching across lawns in directions that defied the sun's position. Other joggers never seemed to notice, but I began running different routes, avoiding streets where the shadow play became too pronounced, too obviously wrong. Inside the house, the phenomenon was more subtle but somehow more unsettling. While cooking dinner, I'd catch my shadow reaching for ingredients I hadn't yet decided to use, or notice it stirring a pot while my hands remained occupied elsewhere. In the study, my silhouette would lean over books I hadn't opened, its posture suggesting intense concentration on texts I couldn't read. Sarah's shadow, I noticed, behaved normally. It followed her movements with predictable precision, falling where physics and light sources dictated it should. This observation both relieved and terrified me. Relieved because it meant I wasn't imposing some mass delusion on our household. Terrified because it meant whatever was happening was specifically targeting me. The first time I saw my shadow interact with a physical object, I was alone in the basement, sorting through boxes we hadn't yet unpacked. The bare bulb overhead cast my silhouette sharply against the concrete wall, and I watched, with a mixture of fascination and growing horror, as my shadow's hand reached toward a box labeled books, and somehow, impossibly, shifted it several inches to the left. The actual box moved. The cardboard scraped against the concrete floor with a sound that echoed in the cramped space. My real hands had been nowhere near it. I stood frozen, staring at the displaced box, trying to construct a rational explanation. Foundation settling. Vibrations from the furnace. Anything but the evidence of my own eyes. That night I lay awake cataloging every shadow in our bedroom. Moonlight through the curtains created a landscape of gray shapes across the walls and ceiling. Sarah's sleeping form, the dresser, the chair where I'd draped my clothes. My own shadow was visible on the far wall, but it wasn't lying down. It sat upright, motionless, as if keeping watch. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, then opened them again. The shadow remained upright. I turned onto my side, facing away from the wall. When I looked back several minutes later, my shadow had turned as well, maintaining its vigilant posture. Sleep became elusive. I'd doze fitfully, waking to find my shadow in impossible positions, standing when I was lying down, facing directions my body wasn't pointed toward, sometimes appearing to pace back and forth across the wall while I remained motionless in bed. During the day, I began to feel observed constantly, as if eyes I couldn't see were tracking my every movement. The sensation was strongest in rooms with multiple light sources, where several shadows should have been competing for space but instead seemed coordinated, synchronized in their wrongness. Sarah noticed my increasing fatigue and agitation, but attributed it to work stress. I'd recently taken on a complex litigation case involving environmental contamination, and the research required long hours and intense concentration. Her concern was loving but distant. She was absorbed in her own professional challenges and the ongoing project of making our house feel like home. I wanted to tell her what I was experiencing, but how do you explain that your shadow has developed a will of its own? How do you describe the growing certainty that something invisible but very real is studying you, learning your habits, perhaps preparing for something you can't imagine? Instead, I researched Dr. Whitmore's work more extensively, driving to universities with archived medical journals from the early 1900s, requesting access to papers that hadn't been digitized. What I found was a progressive descent into obsession and apparent madness, documented in his own words. His early articles were grounded in legitimate psychological theory, exploring the connection between mental health and self-perception. But as the years progressed, his writing became increasingly esoteric, filled with references to shadow consciousness and spiritual bifurcation. His final published paper from 1922 described successful experiments in liberating shadow entities from their host consciousness, and claimed to have created autonomous shadow beings capable of independent thought and action. The paper included detailed diagrams of the sanitarium's layout, showing specific rooms equipped with mirrors and specialized lighting designed to facilitate shadow separation. According to his notes, these separated shadows retained memories and personalities but existed independently of their original hosts, capable of interacting with both the physical and spiritual worlds. The basement of our house, I realized, sat directly beneath what had been Dr. Whitmore's primary laboratory. That evening, I descended to the basement with a flashlight and measuring tape, comparing the foundation's dimensions to the sanitarium blueprints I'd photocopied. The match was exact. Our house had been built on the precise footprint of the hospital's experimental wing, with our basement occupying the same space where Dr. Whitmore had conducted his shadow research. The walls down there were newer than the rest of the house, concrete block instead of the original stone foundation visible in other areas. Someone had wanted to seal off whatever remained of the sanitarium's laboratory, but the space itself hadn't changed. The shadows felt different in that basement, heavier somehow, as if the air retained some residual density from whatever had transpired there decades earlier. I began spending more time down there, trying to understand what was happening to me. The shadow phenomena were strongest in that space. My silhouette would move with complete independence, reaching toward walls, manipulating objects, sometimes appearing to communicate with other shadows I couldn't see casting them. And there were other shadows, faint outlines against the walls that couldn't be traced to any physical object in the room. They moved with purpose, interacting with each other in ways that suggested consciousness, awareness, intent. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that scattered when I turned to look directly at them, like mice surprised by sudden light. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening in late October. I was in the basement, ostensibly checking the furnace but actually studying my shadow's behavior, when I heard footsteps on the floor above. Sarah was working late, and I was alone in the house, but the sounds were unmistakable, measured steps moving from the kitchen toward the living room. I climbed the stairs quietly, expecting to find an intruder, but the first floor was empty. Sarah's purse wasn't on the counter. Her car wasn't in the driveway. I was definitely alone. But in the living room, illuminated by the lamp Sarah had left on, my shadow was standing in the center of the room. Not my actual shadow. I was positioned near the doorway, but a perfect silhouette of my form, upright and motionless in a space where no shadow should exist. As I watched, it began to move. It walked to the bookshelf, reached for a volume, and appeared to page through it. The actual book remained untouched, but the shadow's movements were precise and deliberate, suggesting it was reading something I couldn't see. "What do you want?" I whispered, feeling foolish but desperate for some kind of communication. The shadow turned toward me. For a moment, we regarded each other across the room, a man and his separated shadow, two consciousness that should have been one. Then it raised its hand and pointed toward the basement. I followed, mesmerized and terrified, as my shadow led me down the stairs and across the concrete floor to the far wall. It stopped at a section of newer concrete block and began tracing patterns against the surface, circles and lines that meant nothing to me, but seemed significant to the shadow's understanding. Behind that wall, I realized, lay the heart of Dr. Whitmore's laboratory. Whatever he had done to separate shadows from their hosts Whatever process he had developed to create independent shadow consciousness, the evidence remained buried beneath our house, and my shadow wanted me to find it. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with the idea of breaking through that wall. I researched techniques for opening concrete blocks, made excuses to visit hardware stores, measured and planned in my head. Sarah noticed my increasing distraction, but attributed it to case stress and autumn depression. She suggested I see someone, maybe take a vacation, get some perspective on whatever was troubling me. But perspective was exactly what I was afraid of gaining. The more I understood about my situation, the more terrifying it became. Was I experiencing some kind of psychological break triggered by stress and the house's history? Or was I actually in contact with genuine shadow entities created by a madman's experiments nearly a century ago? The ambiguity was maddening. I found myself questioning every perception, analyzing every experience for signs of delusion or external influence. Was my shadow really moving independently? Or was I imposing patterns on normal shadow play? Were the footsteps I heard genuine sounds or auditory hallucinations? Was the history I'd researched accurate? Or had I unconsciously selected and interpreted information to support a paranoid fantasy? But then I would return to the basement and watch my shadow tracing those patterns on the wall, and the evidence of my eyes would override every rational doubt. The breakthrough came in November, during a particularly vivid episode where my shadow seemed to be teaching me something, showing me specific points on the wall, demonstrating hand positions, guiding me through a process I didn't understand, but felt compelled to follow. I placed my palms against the concrete where my shadow indicated, and felt the blocks shift slightly under pressure. They were loose, held in place by aging mortar that crumbled when disturbed. With minimal effort, I was able to remove several blocks, revealing a space beyond. My flashlight beam illuminated a room that had been sealed for decades. The air that emerged was stale and cold, carrying scents of old paper and something else, something organic and unpleasant that spoke of long confinement. The space was exactly as Dr. Whitmore had left it. Mirrors covered every surface, angled and positioned according to his diagrams. Complex lighting apparatus hung from the ceiling, bulbs and reflectors designed to cast shadows in specific patterns. And covering the walls were his notes, hundreds of pages documenting his experiments, his discoveries, his growing understanding of what he called shadow consciousness. But most unsettling were the shadows themselves. Even with my flashlight providing the only illumination, the room was full of them. Dozens of human silhouettes pressed against the walls and mirrors, moving independently of any light source. They turned toward me as I entered, and I felt their attention like a physical weight. My own shadow detached itself completely, joining the others in what appeared to be a welcoming ceremony. They moved around each other in patterns that suggested communication, possibly even celebration. And I understood with horrible clarity what had happened. Dr. Whitmore hadn't been trying to cure mental illness. He'd been collecting shadows, separating them from their hosts, and trapping them in this underground laboratory. Every patient who'd complained of shadow problems, every staff member who'd reported strange experiences, they'd all contributed to this collection of displaced consciousness. And somehow, by moving into this house, by living above this space, I'd become connected to them. My shadow wasn't just behaving strangely, it was being influenced, perhaps even replaced, by one of Dr. Whitmore's captured entities. The question that terrified me most was whether my consciousness was also being replaced. Was I still myself, or was I becoming something else? A shadow wearing my form, thinking my thoughts, living my life while the real me remained trapped in this underground chamber. I backed out of the room, replaced the concrete blocks as quickly as possible, and returned upstairs. Sarah was home, moving through her evening routine with the comfortable efficiency of someone who felt safe and content in her environment. She smiled when she saw me, asked about my day, shared details about a case she was working on. But as we talked, I found myself studying her shadow on the kitchen wall. It moved normally, predictably, following her gestures with the fidelity I remembered from the early days of our marriage. She was still herself, still unaffected by whatever force was operating in our house, which meant I was the target. Something about me, my psychology, my susceptibility, my presence in this particular space had made me vulnerable to Dr. Whitmore's legacy. That night, I lay in bed watching my shadow maintain its vigil on the wall. Sarah slept peacefully beside me, her breathing deep and regular, while I contemplated the possibility that I was losing myself to something that had been waiting in this house for decades. The shadow turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw something I recognized in its posture. Not malevolence or alien consciousness, but something familiar, something that might actually be me, or might be what I was becoming. In the morning, I would decide whether to tell Sarah what I'd discovered, whether to leave this house and try to escape whatever process was transforming me, or whether to return to that basement room and learn what Dr. Whitmore's shadows wanted to teach me. But for now, in the deep darkness before dawn, I watched my shadow watching me and wondered which one of us was real. Story 6. The first thing I noticed wasn't the decay or the overgrown ivy strangling the Victorian facade. It was the breathing. Standing at the rusted gate of Blackwood Manor, I could swear the entire structure was expanding and contracting with slow, deliberate breaths. The afternoon shadows seemed to pulse across the weathered brick in rhythm with something deeper, something that made my chest tighten with inexplicable dread. Dr. Hammond had warned me the house would be unsettling. As the lead researcher for the Architectural Anomaly Project, I'd investigated dozens of allegedly haunted buildings, but nothing had prepared me for this. The manor squatted on its hill like a massive organism, its windows dark and unfocused as dead eyes. Yet something about those windows suggested they weren't quite as lifeless as they appeared. I'd inherited the property from a great-aunt I'd never met, along with a collection of documents that had drawn the university's attention. The papers included the original blueprints and the personal diary of Cornelius Blackwood, the eccentric architect who designed the house in 1847. His plans revealed proportions that defied conventional architecture, measurements that corresponded precisely to human anatomical ratios, as if he'd been designing not a house, but a body. The front door opened with surprising ease, its hinges silent despite their apparent age. The interior struck me immediately with its warmth. Not the stifling heat of poor ventilation, but the ambient warmth of something alive. The walls, covered in faded burgundy wallpaper, seemed to radiate heat that had nothing to do with sunlight or heating systems. I pressed my palm against the nearest wall and jerked it back. The surface was warm and slightly damp, with a texture that felt disturbingly organic beneath the decorative paper. My footsteps echoed strangely in the entrance hall, each sound seeming to resonate through the walls themselves, before returning as a faint rhythmic pulse. The floorboards creaked not with the random protests of old wood, but in a pattern that suggested something vast and patient, responding to my presence. I found myself walking more softly, though I couldn't explain why. The main hall stretched ahead like a throat, its walls curving inward with subtle irregularity. Gas fixtures lined the walls at intervals that followed no logical pattern, until I realized they corresponded to pulse points on the human body. The realization sent ice through my veins despite the oppressive warmth. Blackwood hadn't just incorporated anatomical proportions into his design, he'd created an architectural nervous system. I made my way toward what the blueprints identified as the library, hoping to find more of Blackwood's papers. The doors throughout the house were positioned asymmetrically, forcing me to navigate corridors that curved and branched like blood vessels. More than once, I found myself disoriented, certain I'd taken a wrong turn, only to discover I was exactly where the blueprints indicated I should be. The house seemed to be rearranging my sense of direction, guiding me through its passages with gentle, persistent pressure. The library occupied what should have been the heart of the house. Here, the ceiling rose to impossible heights, creating a chamber that felt more like a thoracic cavity than a room. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines cracked and faded. But it was the sound that made me pause, a low, rhythmic groaning that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. It took me several minutes to realize the sound was coming from the pipes hidden within the walls. and several minutes more to recognize the rhythm as distinctly cardiac. Behind a glass case, I found Blackwood's diary, its pages yellow and brittle but remarkably preserved. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, but his early notes were methodical and precise. He wrote of studying human anatomy, of measuring cadavers and mapping the precise proportions of organs to body mass. He'd become convinced that architecture was merely another form of anatomy, that buildings could be made to live if designed with sufficient understanding of biological principles. The middle entries detailed his experiments with building materials. He'd mixed human hair into the mortar, incorporated bone meal into the foundation, and sealed what he cryptically referred to as the essence within the walls during construction. His final entries descended into increasingly disturbing territory, describing rituals performed during the house's construction, ceremonies designed to awaken the sleeping giant he was creating. As I read, the groaning in the walls grew more pronounced. The rhythm was definitely cardiac now, impossible to ignore or rationalize away. I could feel it in my chest, a sympathetic resonance that made my own heartbeat quicken and sync with the house's pulse. The temperature seemed to rise with my growing anxiety, and I noticed the walls had begun to glisten with a thin sheen of moisture that caught the dim light like perspiration. The diary's final entry chilled me more than anything else I'd read. Blackwood claimed to have succeeded in his goal, to have created not just a living building, but a conscious one. He wrote of the house's growing awareness, of its ability to influence the emotions and perceptions of its inhabitants. He described feeling watched, feeling the building's attention like a physical weight. Most disturbing of all, he claimed the house had begun to communicate with him, not through words, but through subtle manipulations of temperature, sound, and sensation. I set the diary aside and became aware that the library had grown noticeably warmer. The moisture on the walls had increased, forming slow, viscous droplets that traced lazy paths down the wallpaper like tears or sweat. The cardiac rhythm in the pipes had accelerated, and I realized with growing alarm that it was matching my own elevated pulse. The house was responding to my emotional state, feeding off my fear and anxiety like some vast architectural parasite. Moving through the corridors felt different now that I understood what Blackwood had attempted. Every doorway seemed positioned to force me through specific movements, like blood cells navigating arteries. The asymmetrical layout began to make terrible sense. It was designed to create flow patterns, to guide inhabitants through predetermined paths like nutrients through a digestive system. I was being processed. The sensation of being watched intensified as I explored deeper into the house. Not watched by eyes, but by the building itself, its walls monitoring my movements, its floors sensing my weight and direction, its very atmosphere tasting my fear. The moisture on the walls had thickened into an unmistakably viscous substance that clung to my fingers when I accidentally brushed against it. It was warm and slightly alkaline, like diluted stomach acid. In what the blueprints labeled as the conservatory, I discovered the most disturbing feature yet. The room's walls were lined with what appeared to be ventilation grates, but the pattern of holes was too organic, too deliberately biological. They pulsed with the same rhythm as the pipes, and warm, humid air flowed through them in cycles that matched breathing patterns. The entire room expanded and contracted almost imperceptibly, its walls moving like ribs around massive lungs. I tried to convince myself that what I was experiencing could be explained rationally. Old houses settled in patterns that might seem rhythmic. Temperature fluctuations could create the illusion of breathing. The moisture could be condensation from poor ventilation. But these explanations felt increasingly hollow as the house's responses grew more pronounced and more clearly connected to my presence. The corridors began to feel tighter, as if the walls were slowly contracting around me. The warm, humid air grew thicker, more difficult to breathe. Each step seemed to generate a response from the building, a slight tremor in the walls, a change in air pressure, a subtle shift in the cardiac rhythm that filled the space like a heartbeat amplified through a stethoscope. By evening, I could no longer deny what was happening. The house was alive, not metaphorically but literally. Blackwood had succeeded in creating something that transcended normal architecture, something that existed in the liminal space between building and organism. It was aware of me, studying me, possibly even feeding off my presence in ways I couldn't begin to understand. The final test came when I tried to leave. The front door, which had opened so easily upon my arrival, now resisted my efforts. Not locked. There was no mechanism I could identify, but heavy and unresponsive, as if the house itself was reluctant to let me go. The doorknob was warm and slightly sticky under my palm, and I could swear I felt a pulse beneath the metal surface. When the door finally opened, it did so with what sounded disturbingly like a sigh. The evening air outside felt shockingly cold and thin after the oppressive warmth of the interior. I stumbled down the front steps, gasping like someone who'd been holding their breath underwater. Behind me, the house settled back into stillness, its windows once again dark and lifeless. But as I reached the gate, I turned back one final time. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something shift behind one of the upper windows. Not a person or a shadow, but a subtle movement like an eyelid slowly closing. The building seemed to sag slightly, as if disappointed by my departure. I've been staying in a hotel in town for 3 days now, but I can't stop thinking about the house. My sleep is disrupted by dreams of warm, pulsing corridors and walls that breathe. I find myself checking my pulse obsessively, convinced it's still synchronized with something vast and patient waiting on the hill. The rational part of my mind insists that what I experienced was a combination of suggestion, anxiety, and the power of an old building to play tricks on perception. But late at night, when I'm drifting between sleep and waking, I can still feel it. The house's awareness, its slow, patient breathing, its cardiac rhythm that seems to echo in my chest. Sometimes I catch myself breathing in sync with a rhythm that isn't there, or pressing my ear to the hotel room wall as if listening for some impossible heartbeat hidden within the plaster. I know I have to go back. The university expects a full report, and the documents I've gathered are only the beginning of what might be the most significant architectural discovery in decades. But more than that, I feel drawn back by something I can't quite name, a pull that feels less like curiosity and more like hunger. Not my hunger, but something else's. The house is waiting. I can feel it from here, patient and eternal, breathing slowly in the darkness. And despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I know I'll return tomorrow. Because the most terrifying thing about Blackwood Manor isn't that it might be alive. It's that I'm no longer entirely certain where the house ends and I begin. Story 7. The blueprints were wrong. I discovered this 3 weeks after we moved into the Victorian house on Maple Street, when I finally got around to measuring the second floor for the renovation Sarah had been planning. The hallway should have been 12 feet longer than it actually was. I checked the original plans twice, then measured again with my father's old tape measure, the one that had never lied to me in 20 years of weekend projects. The numbers didn't add up. Sarah laughed when I mentioned it over dinner, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth as she gave me that look, the one that suggested I'd been working too hard again. She reminded me that old houses settle, that walls get moved, that previous owners make changes that don't always make it onto paper. All reasonable explanations that should have satisfied me. They didn't. I found myself walking that hallway at odd hours, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors, counting steps like a man possessed. From the staircase to the master bedroom, 43 steps. From the master bedroom to the guest room, 16 steps. From the guest room to the bathroom, 11 steps. From the bathroom back to the staircase, 18 steps. That left 2 steps unaccounted for. 2 steps that, according to the blueprints, should have led to a small room, perhaps a study or a nursery, tucked behind what was now simply an unbroken wall between the guest room and bathroom. The wall felt solid enough when I pressed my palms against it, searching for hollow spots or hidden seams. The paint was fresh, the wallpaper pattern continuous. Nothing suggested a concealed entrance. But the mathematics haunted me. It was Sarah who first noticed the temperature drop on Tuesday nights. She mentioned it casually while folding laundry, how she'd started wearing her thick robe to bed on Tuesdays because the upstairs felt different somehow. Not just cold, but expectant, like the house was holding its breath. I began paying closer attention to Tuesday nights, though I couldn't say why. The sensation started around 11:30, a subtle shift in the air pressure that made my ears pop. The house's usual settling sounds, the gentle creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to temperature changes, would fade to an unnatural silence. Even the oak tree outside our bedroom window, which typically scratched against the gutters when the wind picked up, fell still. By 11:45, the hallway would smell different. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong. Like old photograph albums and mothballs, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of my grandmother's perfume, the kind she'd worn to church every Sunday until dementia took her memories, but left her smell lingering in empty rooms. The first time I saw the door, I thought I was dreaming. It was 12:03 a.m. on a Tuesday in November when I got up to use the bathroom and found the hallway changed. Where the unbroken wall between the guest room and bathroom had always stood, a door now waited. Not a modern door that might have been installed during some forgotten renovation, but something older, heavy dark wood with brass hinges that had developed a green patina. The doorknob was crystal, the kind that caught light and threw it back in prismatic fragments. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart hammering against my ribs, staring at something that couldn't exist. The rational part of my mind cataloged all the ways this was impossible. I'd examined this wall dozens of times. I'd measured it. I'd pressed against it, searching for hidden panels. There had been no door, yet here it stood, as solid and real as everything else in the house. The doorknob was cold under my palm, so cold it almost burned. I turned it slowly, expecting resistance, expecting the whole illusion to dissolve. Instead, the door opened with a whisper of displaced air that carried scents of tobacco and lavender and something else. Something that made me think of Sunday afternoons in houses I'd never visited. The room beyond defied the laws of space and architecture. It stretched further than should have been possible, furnished with a curious mixture of pieces from different eras. A Victorian settee sat beside a mid-century modern coffee table. Heavy drapes framed windows that shouldn't exist. Windows that looked out onto a garden I'd never seen, where flowers bloomed in what appeared to be perpetual afternoon light, despite the November darkness outside our real windows. But it was the photographs that made my breath catch. They covered every surface, the mantelpiece, the end tables, even the top of an old radio that looked like it belonged in the 1940s. Dozens of photographs in frames of silver and wood and plastic, showing families I didn't recognize. Wedding portraits where the fashion suggested the 1920s, birthday parties that could have been from the 1950s, Christmas mornings that felt distinctly 1960s, based on the toys scattered beneath aluminum trees. Normal family photographs, except for the way the people in them seemed to be looking at me. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking as I pulled the door closed. When I turned around, Sarah stood at the top of the stairs in her thick robe, her hair disheveled from sleep. She asked if I was all right, and I found myself unable to explain what I'd just seen. How could I tell her about a room that shouldn't exist, filled with photographs of strangers who watched me with eyes that followed my movement? Instead, I mumbled something about checking a noise and guided her back to bed. The next morning, the door was gone. The wall stood unbroken, innocent, exactly as it had for weeks. I ran my hands over the wallpaper, searching for seams or hinges or any sign that a door had ever existed there. Nothing. Sarah watched me from the doorway to the guest room, her expression unreadable. When I asked if she'd noticed anything strange about the hallway, she shook her head but didn't quite meet my eyes. The following Tuesday, I waited. I positioned myself in the guest room with the door cracked open, giving me a clear view of the wall where the mysterious door had appeared. At 11:30 p.m., the temperature began to drop. At 11:45, that strange perfumed scent drifted through the hallway. At midnight exactly, the wall began to shift. It was like watching a time-lapse film of construction in reverse. The wallpaper seemed to peel away at the edges, revealing the dark wood underneath. The brass hinges materialized first, then the crystal doorknob, until finally the entire door stood complete, as solid and real as if it had always been there. This time, I forced myself to be methodical. I approached slowly, documenting every detail my eyes could capture. The wood grain in the door, the way the brass hinges reflected the hallway light, the weight of the crystal knob in my hand. Inside, the room had changed. The furniture was different, more angular, with the clean lines and bold colors I associated with the 1970s. Orange shag carpet covered the floor. A lava lamp bubbled on a teak side table. But the photographs remained, though their subjects had changed too. Now they showed families from that decade. Children with long hair and bell-bottom jeans, parents in earth tones and wide lapels. And again, all of them seemed to be looking at me. I moved closer to examine one photograph. A family gathered around a Christmas tree, the children's faces bright with excitement as they unwrapped presents. The father looked familiar somehow, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him. Then I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. In the background of the photograph, barely visible through a doorway, stood a figure I recognized. It was me. Not someone who looked like me, but actually me, wearing the same clothes I wore that Tuesday night, standing in what appeared to be the same hallway outside the mysterious room. The figure was partially obscured and blurry, as if captured accidentally at the edge of the frame, but unmistakably me. I dropped the photograph, hearing the glass crack against the orange carpet. When I looked down to assess the damage, I saw other photographs scattered on the floor, photographs that hadn't been there moments before, photographs of families from different decades, all containing that same barely visible figure in the background. Me, always me, standing in doorways, reflected in mirrors, glimpsed through windows, present in family moments I had never experienced, in houses I had never visited, wearing clothes I had never owned. Some of the photographs appeared decades old, their edges yellowed and corners rounded from handling. Others looked more recent, their colors still bright and sharp. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Trick photography, digital manipulation, elaborate hoaxes, but the photographs felt real in my hands. They smelled like the chemicals used in old darkrooms. They bore the subtle imperfections of analog photography, slightly off-center compositions, minor focus issues, the kind of human touches that digital manipulation rarely captured convincingly. I gathered the fallen photographs, my hands trembling as I studied each one. In a 1950s family picnic, I stood beside a barbecue grill, wearing clothes I'd never owned. In a 1960s birthday party, I appeared in a mirror behind the cake table. In a 1980s wedding reception, I was visible through a window, watching from outside. When I looked up from the photographs, the family in the Christmas picture had moved. The children were no longer focused on their presents. The parents had turned slightly in their chairs. All of them were looking directly at me now, their eyes following my movement as I stumbled backward toward the door. I ran. I bolted from the room and slammed the door behind me, pressing my back against it as if it might open on its own. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold that had settled over the hallway. When Sarah found me there 20 minutes later, I was still pressed against the door, clutching the photographs like evidence of a crime I couldn't name. She helped me to our bedroom, her hands gentle but firm, and listened as I tried to explain what I'd experienced. Her silence was more unsettling than any argument would have been. The following Tuesday, Sarah was waiting for me. I found her standing in the hallway at 11:58 p.m., still in her work clothes despite the late hour. She held a digital camera in one hand and a flashlight in the other, her expression determined in a way that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her practical nature. She intended to document whatever happened next. We watched together as the door materialized, and I saw my own disbelief reflected in her widening eyes. The smell of old photographs and mothballs drifted around us as the crystal doorknob caught the hallway light and scattered it in prismatic fragments across the walls. This time, the room showed us the 1980s. Neon colors and geometric patterns dominated the space. A boombox sat on a glass coffee table beside a Rubik's Cube and a stack of vinyl records. The photographs covering every surface showed families in shoulder-padded clothing and oversized glasses, their hair teased into gravity-defying configurations. Sarah methodically documented everything with her camera, the flash illuminating corners and details I might have missed. She photographed the furniture, the decorations, the windows that looked out onto that impossible garden. But when she turned her attention to the family photographs scattered throughout the room, her steady composure cracked. In every single photograph, there I was. Not just in one or two, but in all of them. Sometimes clearly visible, sometimes barely a shadow at the edge of the frame, but always present. Sarah zoomed in on several images with her camera's digital display, confirming what I'd seen the previous week. The me in these photographs looked exactly like the me standing in the room. Same face, same height, same build. But the clothes were different, appropriate to each decade represented. In the 1950s photographs, I wore suspenders and a thin tie. In the 1960s images, I appeared in narrow lapels and pocket squares. In the 1970s pictures, I sported wide collars and earth tones. As if I had lived through all these decades. As if I had been present for all these family moments. As if I belonged in these photographs of people I had never met. Sarah and I spent 3 hours in that room documenting everything we could find. We discovered a pattern. Each Tuesday night, the room represented a different decade, cycling through the 20th century in reverse chronological order. The 1980s this week, the 1970s the week before, the 1960s before that. But more disturbing than the room's temporal nature was the consistency of my appearance in the photographs. Sarah found images dating back to what appeared to be the 1920s, all containing that same figure that was unmistakably me, wearing period-appropriate clothing, present at family gatherings I could never have attended. When dawn approached, we made a decision that would haunt me for weeks to come. We decided to stay. Sarah wanted to document what happened when morning came, and I found myself agreeing despite every instinct screaming at me to leave. We had questions that needed answers. How could photographs from decades before my birth contain my image? How could a room exist that defied the basic laws of space and time? How could I be present in family moments I had never experienced? As the first pale light of dawn crept through the impossible windows, we felt the change beginning. The temperature in the room began to rise, but not in the gradual way of normal warming. It was immediate and intense, like stepping from an air-conditioned building into a summer parking lot. The air grew thick and humid, carrying new scents, developing chemicals and vinegar and something metallic that made my mouth taste like copper. The photographs began to move. Not dramatically, not like some carnival funhouse trick, but subtly. Facial expressions shifted. Eyes that had been looking to the left now gazed to the right. Hands that had been raised in greeting now rested at sides. People who had been seated now stood. And in every photograph, the figure that was me began to move closer to the center of the frame. I watched myself step forward in a dozen different family portraits, moving from the shadows at the edges into the bright center of each scene. In some photographs, my figure developed color and clarity, becoming less like a mysterious presence and more like an integral part of each family gathering. Sarah's camera captured everything, though the flash seemed to affect the room strangely, causing the moving figures in the photographs to pause momentarily before resuming their migrations. She was methodical even in her obvious terror, documenting each change as if building a case for something she couldn't yet name. When the morning sun finally crested the horizon outside the real windows of our house, the room began to dissolve around us. Not all at once, but gradually, like a photograph developing in reverse. The furniture faded first, becoming translucent and then transparent before disappearing entirely. The walls began to recede, revealing the familiar boundaries of our hallway. The impossible windows showing that eternal garden grew smaller and dimmer until they vanished completely. But we were still inside the room as it disappeared. Sarah and I found ourselves standing in what should have been solid wall space, watching the last vestiges of that impossible place fade around us. For a moment that lasted forever, we existed in the space between real and unreal, between what was and what couldn't be. Then the wall reappeared, and we were standing in our hallway, solid and normal and completely impossible. Sarah's camera was gone. The photographs we'd gathered were gone. The only evidence of our 3 hours in that temporal room was the memory itself, and a lingering scent of mothballs and old perfume that clung to our clothes. But that afternoon, Sarah found something that changed everything. She discovered a box in the basement while looking for Christmas decorations, tucked behind the furnace in a space we'd never explored. Inside were hundreds of photographs spanning decades, all showing the same families we'd seen in the Tuesday room. Wedding portraits, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer vacations, all featuring people we didn't recognize but somehow felt we knew. And in every single photograph, there I was. Not the me of today, but versions of me dressed appropriately for each era, appearing in family moments I couldn't remember experiencing. The me in the 1950s photographs looked younger somehow, with smoother skin and brighter eyes. The me in the 1930s images appeared younger still, almost like a teenager despite my adult height and build. As if I had been aging backward through the decades. As if I had been living these Tuesday nights for much longer than I could remember. Sarah spread the photographs across our kitchen table, organizing them chronologically. The pattern became undeniable. I appeared in family photographs spanning nearly a century, growing younger in each decade as we moved backward through time. The most recent photographs, those from the 1980s and 1990s, showed me as I appeared today. But the oldest photographs, dating to what appeared to be the 1910s, showed me as a child, barely recognizable, but unmistakably the same person, which was impossible. I was born in 1979. I had birth certificates and school records and childhood memories that proved my existence in the normal timeline, yet here was photographic evidence suggesting I had lived through nearly a century of Tuesday nights, aging backward through time, present at family gatherings of people I had never met. Sarah asked if I remembered any of these moments, and I told her the truth. I remembered none of them. But even as I spoke, I felt something stirring at the edges of my consciousness. Not quite memories, but impressions. The taste of birthday cake that was too sweet. The smell of pine needles from Christmas trees that somehow felt familiar. The sound of children laughing in ways that echoed with recognition I couldn't explain. As the weeks passed, I found myself looking forward to Tuesday nights with an anticipation that frightened me. Sarah began to notice changes in my behavior on those days. How I would grow restless and distracted. How I would find excuses to walk the hallway. How I would stand before that innocent wall as if waiting for something. She suggested we leave the house, take a vacation, stay in a hotel on Tuesday nights to break whatever cycle we'd stumbled into. But I found myself resistant to the idea in ways I couldn't articulate. The Tuesday room had become more than a mystery to be solved. It had become a need I couldn't satisfy anywhere else. 3 weeks ago, I stopped leaving the room before dawn. Sarah pleaded with me to come back to bed as the morning approached, but I couldn't make myself walk through that doorway. I needed to understand what happened to the people who stayed, who allowed themselves to be absorbed into whatever temporal paradox the room represented. The answer came as the walls began to fade around me. I felt myself becoming part of the room's collection, my image appearing in fresh photographs even as I stood there watching. But instead of displacing my present existence, I found myself living parallel lives, experiencing the Tuesday nights of multiple decades simultaneously. I remembered being at all those family gatherings now, Christmas mornings with the Hendersons in 1954, birthday parties with the Kowalskis in 1967, wedding receptions with the Garcias in 1973. I had been there for all of them, aging backward through time, collecting decades of memories that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. But I also remained in the present, returning to my normal life each Wednesday morning, carrying the weight of all those parallel experiences. Sarah could see the change in me, how I would reference people and events I had never encountered in our shared timeline, how I would sometimes call her by names of women I had never mentioned meeting. I was becoming unstuck in time, living multiple lives across multiple decades, collecting memories that belonged to all of them and none of them. And now, as I write this account on a Wednesday morning in November, I realize the most terrifying truth of all. I can no longer remember which life is real. The memories of our courtship and marriage feel no more or less authentic than my memories of the Hendersons' Christmas mornings or the Kowalskis' birthday parties. Sarah found me writing this morning, though she claims I was asleep in bed beside her all night. She insists there was no Tuesday room, no photographs, no temporal paradox. She shows me the unbroken wall in our hallway and asks me to explain how I could have imagined such elaborate impossibilities. But I know what I've experienced. I know what I've seen. I know who I've been across all those decades of Tuesday nights. The only question now is whether Sarah is trying to help me maintain my sanity, or whether she's been living her own version of this temporal displacement, forgetting each Wednesday morning what we discover each Tuesday night. Because yesterday, while looking through that box of photographs we found in the basement, the box she now claims never existed, I found something that changed my understanding of everything. A photograph of our wedding day, showing Sarah and me in clothes we never wore, in a church we never visited, surrounded by people we never invited. But unmistakably us, unmistakably happy, unmistakably married, in a ceremony I cannot remember attending. The date on the back of the photograph is from 1962. 17 years before I was born. 19 years before Sarah was born. But there we are, young and smiling, and impossibly present in a decade that should have passed before our parents were even born. Tonight is Tuesday. Sarah says she's going to stay up with me again, to document whatever I think I'm experiencing, to help me understand the difference between reality and whatever elaborate fantasy my mind has constructed. She holds my hand and promises we'll face this together, that we'll find answers to questions that may not have rational solutions. But I know now that Sarah has been with me through all of this. Not just the recent Tuesday nights, but all of them, stretching back through decades of temporal displacement. In some of the photographs she appears as herself. In others, she's someone else entirely. Different names, different faces, but unmistakably the same soul wearing different forms across different eras. We have been living these parallel lives together, collecting memories from decades we never experienced, aging backward through time, becoming unstuck from the linear progression that everyone else takes for granted. The only question remaining is whether this is the reality where we belong, or just another Tuesday night in a sequence that spans a century of possibilities. In 12 hours, I'll have my answer. Or I'll forget the question entirely, waking Wednesday morning with nothing but the lingering scent of mothballs and old perfume to remind me that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The mathematics still don't add up, and I'm beginning to suspect they never will. Story 8. The key turned with a resistance that suggested decades of disuse. Metal grinding against metal, in a sound that set my teeth on edge. Uncle Mortimer's house exhaled stale air when I finally pushed open the front door, carrying with it the scent of old wood, dust, and something else. Something medicinal and sharp that made my sinuses burn. I'd expected the clutter. Mortimer had always been a collector, filling his antique shop with curiosities that most people would consider junk. What I hadn't expected was the systematic organization of his obsession. The living room had been converted into a laboratory of sorts, every surface covered with glass vials arranged in perfect rows. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one sealed with wax and cork, each bearing a small white label written in Mortimer's precise handwriting. The first label I examined read, Eleanor Hutchins, March 15th, 1987, 3:47 a.m. The vial contained what appeared to be nothing more than air, though a faint film of condensation clung to the inner walls. I picked up another, Samuel Torres, June 2nd, 1992, 11:23 p.m. Then another, Margaret Woolsey, October 8th, 1985, 6:15 a.m. A chill that had nothing to do with the house's temperature crept up my spine. The dates spanned decades, the times recorded with obsessive precision. I remembered Mortimer's letters during his final years, increasingly erratic missives about his research, and his growing conviction that he had discovered something profound about the nature of human existence. I dismissed them as the ramblings of an aging mind, but standing in that room surrounded by his collection, I began to understand the depth of his delusion. The basement held his notes, Boxes of journals, newspaper clippings, hospital records, and obituaries, all meticulously cross-referenced with the vials upstairs. Mortimer's theory, laid out in pages of cramped handwriting, was both simple and disturbing. The last breath contained the essence of the soul, and if captured at the precise moment of departure, that essence could be preserved indefinitely. He had haunted hospitals, nursing homes, and hospices for 40 years, convincing himself that he was performing a sacred duty. The more I read, the more my stomach churned. The man I'd known as eccentric but harmless had been systematically violating the dying moments of strangers, believing he was saving their souls in glass containers. I should have left then. Should have called someone, the authorities, a mental health facility, anyone who could deal with the aftermath of Mortimer's madness. Instead, I found myself drawn back to the living room, studying the vials with a mixture of disgust and morbid fascination. That's when I knocked over the first one. It happened as I was trying to clear a path through the maze of shelving. My elbow caught the edge of a small table, sending a single vial tumbling to the hardwood floor. The glass shattered with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent house, releasing what should have been nothing more than stale air. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hair on my arm stood up as if charged with static electricity. For a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something. A whisper, almost too faint to register, speaking words I couldn't quite understand. Then the sensation passed, leaving me standing among the shards of broken glass, feeling foolish and unsettled. I swept up the pieces, reading the label one last time before throwing it away. Thomas Brennan, August 14th, 1983, 2:08 a.m. The name meant nothing to me, but I found myself wondering who Thomas Brennan had been, what his last thoughts might have contained. The whispers started that night. I'd decided to stay in Mortimer's house while I sorted through his belongings, a decision that seemed increasingly unwise as darkness fell. The old Victorian creaked and settled around me, its wooden bones protesting the weight of decades. But the sounds I heard weren't the familiar groans of an aging structure. They were voices, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, or perhaps the house's old heating system, struggling to life. But as I lay in Mortimer's narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispers became impossible to ignore. They rose and fell like a gentle tide, never quite loud enough to make out individual words, but unmistakably human in their cadence. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that weren't my own. I was in a hospital room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the taste of copper and fear heavy on my tongue. Machines beeped steadily around me, monitoring a life that was slipping away like water through cupped hands. Someone was holding my hand, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair who whispered that everything would be all right, even though we both knew it wasn't true. I woke gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dream had felt more vivid than any I'd ever experienced, complete with sensations and emotions that belonged to someone else entirely. Thomas Brennan, I realized with a certainty that made my skin crawl. I had somehow experienced Thomas Brennan's final moments. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. I'd been reading Mortimer's journals all day, filling my head with his obsessions and delusions. It was natural that my subconscious would process that information through dreams. The broken vial meant nothing, just a coincidence that had triggered my imagination. But the explanations felt hollow, especially when I found the photograph. It was tucked into one of Mortimer's journals, a newspaper clipping from 1983. The headline read, "Local teacher passes after battle with cancer," and beneath it was a picture of a man in his 50s with gentle eyes and a tired smile. Thomas Brennan, the face from my dream, identical in every detail down to the small scar on his left temple. I had never seen that photograph before, had never heard of Thomas Brennan until I read his name on the broken vial. Yet I had dreamed his face, his memories, his final moments with perfect clarity. My hands shook as I set the clipping aside and returned to examining the vials. Each one now seemed less like the product of a madman's delusion and more like something far more disturbing. If Mortimer had somehow been right, if these glass containers really did hold the essence of the departed, then what had I unleashed when I broke that first one? The answer came sooner than I wanted. Over the following days, more accidents occurred. A vial would slip from my grasp, or I'd misjudge the stability of a shelf, sending glass containers tumbling to their destruction. Each breaking released another voice into the house, another set of memories that would visit me in dreams. I experienced the lives of strangers, their loves and losses, their fears and regrets, their final moments of confusion or acceptance. Eleanor Hutchins had been a seamstress who worried about her cats. Samuel Torres had been a construction worker who never got to see his grandson born. Margaret Woolsey had been a librarian who died clutching a book of poetry. Their stories filled my sleeping hours, blurring the lines between my consciousness and theirs. During the day, the whispers grew stronger. I would catch fragments of conversation, snippets of memories spoken in voices that belonged to the dead. They weren't malevolent. If anything, they seemed lost, confused by their sudden freedom from glass prisons. But their presence pressed against my sanity like a weight I couldn't lift. I began to question everything. Was I really hearing voices, or was the isolation and stress of dealing with Mortimer's madness taking its toll on my mind? The dreams could be explained by the photographs and documents I'd found, my brain constructing false memories from fragments of information. The temperature drops could be drafts in an old house. The whispers could be auditory hallucinations brought on by guilt and exhaustion. But the explanations felt increasingly inadequate as the phenomena intensified. Objects would move when I wasn't looking. Shadows would shift in my peripheral vision. The house itself seemed to pulse with an energy that had nothing to do with electricity or gas. On the fourth day, I found the vial with my name on it. It was sitting alone on Mortimer's desk, separated from the others as if it held special significance. The label was written in the same precise handwriting, but the ink looked fresher, newer than the others. David Hartwell, June 28, 2025, 11:47 p.m. 3 days from now. My legs gave out, sending me crashing into Mortimer's chair. The date stared up at me with impossible certainty, a prediction that made no sense yet filled me with primal terror. How could Mortimer have captured my final breath when I was still alive? When had he even had the opportunity? I searched through his journals frantically, looking for any mention of my name or explanation for the vial's existence. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Pages and pages of notes about me, observations spanning years, details about my habits, my health, my family history. Mortimer had been watching me, studying me, preparing for something I couldn't comprehend. The final entry, dated just a week before his death, contained only a single line. The collection must be preserved. David will understand when the time comes. I hurled the journal across the room, watching it slam against the wall and scatter pages across the floor. This was insanity. Mortimer had been a sick old man with a grotesque obsession, nothing more. The vials contained air, not souls. The whispers were products of my overstressed mind. The dreams were coincidences, explained by subconscious processing of information I'd absorbed while reading his research. But even as I tried to rationalize what was happening, I could feel their presence growing stronger. The freed souls, or whatever they were, pressed closer, their whispers becoming more insistent. They seemed drawn to me, perhaps recognizing something in my living breath that resonated with their captured essence. I grabbed the vial with my name and held it up to the light. The glass was clear, the contents apparently empty, but something about it made my skin crawl. If I smashed it, would I experience my own death? Would I see my future, laid out in all its grim certainty? The thought was too terrifying to contemplate, yet I couldn't put the vial down. The date pulsed in my vision. June 28th, 2025. 3 days. 3 days until whatever Mortimer had foreseen would come to pass. I set the vial carefully back on the desk and backed away, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The whispers seemed to anticipate something, rising in volume and urgency. The house itself held its breath. waiting for a revelation I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. That night, sleep brought no relief. Instead of experiencing the deaths of strangers, I found myself reliving moments from my own life. Childhood memories, conversations with friends, pivotal decisions that had shaped my path. But they felt different somehow, viewed from an external perspective, as if I were watching someone else's story unfold. I woke to find myself standing in the living room, surrounded by broken glass. Dozens of vials lay shattered at my feet, their contents released into the air that now thrummed with invisible presence. I had no memory of getting out of bed, no recollection of the destruction I'd apparently caused while sleepwalking. The whispers were everywhere now, a constant susurrus of voices that followed me through every room. They spoke of lives interrupted, of stories left unfinished, of the strange comfort they'd found in their glass prisons. Some seemed grateful for their freedom, while others mourned the loss of their containers, afraid of what would happen now that they had nowhere to hide. And through it all, one question echoed in my mind. What would happen in 2 days, when the date on my vial arrived? I tried to leave the house multiple times, but something always drew me back. My car wouldn't start, despite having run perfectly the day before. The phone lines were dead, cutting off any chance of calling for help. Even when I walked to the road on foot, I found myself turning around after a few steps, compelled by an urgency I couldn't explain to return to Mortimer's collection. The vials seemed to be calling to me, demanding my attention and care. Those that remained intact glowed with an inner light that had nothing to do with the fading daylight filtering through the windows. They pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, as if they were somehow connected to my life force. By the second night, I understood what Mortimer had really been doing. The souls weren't prisoners in their glass containers. They were patients, kept stable and coherent by the vessels that held them. Released too quickly, without proper preparation, they became confused and desperate, seeking new vessels to inhabit. They were trying to possess me. I could feel them pressing against the boundaries of my consciousness, testing for weaknesses they could exploit. My dreams became battlegrounds where dozens of personalities fought for control, each one convinced that my body would provide the sanctuary they desperately needed. But there was something else, something that made my situation different from a simple haunting. The vial with my name suggested that I wasn't just a random victim. I was part of Mortimer's plan, a predetermined element in whatever game he'd been playing. As June 28th dawned, I sat in his chair, staring at the vial that bore my name and the time of my supposed death. 11:47 p.m., less than 16 hours away. The house had grown quiet, as if every soul within its walls was holding its breath. The morning light revealed the full extent of the damage I'd done over the past few days. Broken glass covered every surface, and the air itself seemed thick with invisible presence. Yet I felt calmer than I had since arriving, filled with a strange sense of inevitability. Perhaps this had always been my fate. Perhaps Mortimer had seen something in me years ago, recognized some quality that made me suitable for his purposes. The inheritance hadn't been a random bequest. It had been a carefully orchestrated trap, designed to bring me here at exactly the right moment. But for what purpose? What did he hope to accomplish by adding my soul to his collection? The answer came as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the dusty windows. I found a final journal hidden in Mortimer's desk, one I'd somehow overlooked during my earlier searches. Its pages contained the truth about his research, the real reason behind his decades of obsession. He hadn't been collecting souls for their own sake. He'd been gathering them for a specific purpose, assembling the components for something far more ambitious than simple preservation. Each vial represented a life force, a quantum of human consciousness that could be combined with others to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Mortimer had been trying to build a god, not in any traditional sense, but as a collective consciousness formed from the experiences and memories of hundreds of individuals, a being that would possess the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had ever lived, freed from the limitations of individual mortality. And I was to be the final component, the living soul that would give this artificial deity the spark of animation it needed to truly exist. The time on my vial wasn't predicting my death. It was marking my transformation. As 11:47 p.m. approached, I made my choice. I could try to run, attempt to escape whatever fate Mortimer had planned for me, or I could accept my role in his grand design, become part of something larger than myself. The whispers grew louder, urging me toward transcendence. The broken vials on the floor began to glow more brightly, their freed contents swirling around me in patterns that defied natural explanation. I felt their hunger, their need for completion, their desperate desire to become whole again. I picked up the vial with my name and held it against the light of the setting sun. The glass was warm to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat exactly. Whatever was inside, my soul, my future, my destiny, seemed to recognize me, calling out with a voice I couldn't quite hear. The clock on Mortimer's desk showed 11:46 p.m. I closed my eyes and waited, feeling the weight of hundreds of souls pressing against my consciousness. In 1 minute, I would learn whether Mortimer's vision had been madness or revelation, whether the whispers in the walls were symptoms of my deteriorating sanity or the voices of the dead, seeking resurrection through my sacrifice. The clock began to chime midnight, and I felt something fundamental shift in the fabric of reality around me. The boundary between life and death, between individual consciousness and collective existence, began to blur. And in that moment of transformation, I finally understood what I had inherited from my uncle. Not just a house full of glass containers, but a responsibility that stretched far beyond my comprehension. The vial in my hands grew warm, then hot, then blazing with an intensity that should have burned my flesh. But instead of pain, I felt only a profound sense of completion, as if I had finally found the purpose that had been missing from my life. Whether what happened next was real, or the final hallucination of a mind pushed beyond its limits, I cannot say. But as the clock finished chiming, and silence fell over the house once more, I knew with absolute certainty that David Hartwell, the man who had inherited his uncle's madness, would never leave that room again. What emerged in his place was something entirely new, something that carried within itself the memories and experiences of everyone who had ever drawn their last breath in the presence of Mortimer's collection. The vials no longer glowed in the darkness, their contents finally free to join the greater consciousness that now inhabited the house on Elm Street. And somewhere in that vast collective mind, a small part that had once been David Hartwell wondered if anyone would ever discover the truth about what Mortimer had really achieved, or if they would simply dismiss it all as the delusions of a madman, never understanding that some obsessions are too powerful to die with their creators. Story 9. The moving truck pulled away, leaving tire tracks in the frost-covered driveway, and me standing alone before my half of the duplex. January in Portland meant gray skies that pressed down like a wool blanket, and the Victorian structure before me seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the clouds. Sarah had been right about the place having character, though as I fumbled with the keys, I wondered if that character might be more than we'd bargained for. She'd found the listing while I was overseas on assignment, describing it as perfect for a fresh start. The photography work had dried up in Seattle, and after the divorce, a change of scenery felt necessary. The rent was reasonable, the neighborhood quiet, and most importantly, it was ours, or would be, once Sarah finished her residency and could join me in 3 months. The interior smelled of fresh paint and lemon cleanser, though underneath lurked something mustier, like old newspapers left in a basement. Hardwood floors creaked pleasantly under my feet as I explored the space. The living room featured a brick fireplace. The kitchen had been recently updated, and upstairs, 2 bedrooms shared a hallway lined with period-appropriate wallpaper. Everything seemed normal, welcoming even, until I reached the master bedroom. The shared wall ran along the eastern side, painted white like the others, but somehow different. I pressed my palm against it, expecting the solid feel of plaster and wood, but instead found an almost imperceptible warmth. Not unpleasant, just noticeable. The realtor had mentioned the building's age, constructed in 1923, and older houses often had quirky heating issues. That first night, Unpacking boxes by lamplight, I heard them. The sounds began around 10 o'clock. A muffled conversation, two voices moving through what I assumed was the neighboring unit's living room. Then music started, something from the 40s or 50s, all brass and crooning vocals, the kind my grandmother used to play. The volume was considerate, just audible enough to confirm I had neighbors. By week 2, I'd established their routine. The music always started around 10, lasting until midnight. Conversations in the late evening, sometimes heated, but never quite loud enough to make out words. And occasionally, in the early morning hours, the sound that bothered me most, a rhythmic thumping against the shared wall, like someone rocking in a chair or perhaps bouncing something. I debated introducing myself, but kept postponing it. City living had made me cautious about neighborly relationships. Too much familiarity could become problematic if things went south. Besides, they seemed quiet enough, and I had deadlines to meet. The photography project I'd taken on involved documenting Portland's historic neighborhoods, which meant long days walking streets and early mornings catching the right light. I'd return home exhausted, often falling asleep to those distant conversations and vintage melodies bleeding through the wall. It was during the 3rd week that I began paying closer attention to the sounds. The music had a repetitive quality, the same songs in the same order, night after night. The conversations followed patterns too, rising and falling in familiar rhythms. Most unsettling was how the wall seemed to grow warmer during these evening concerts, warm enough that I'd taken to avoiding that side of the bedroom entirely. One evening, driven by curiosity and mild annoyance at the routine's predictability, I decided to make contact. I knocked on the shared wall, 3 firm raps, and waited. The music stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. Then, after nearly 5 minutes, it resumed exactly where it had left off. The next day, I walked around to the other side of the duplex. The entrance was identical to mine, down to the brass house numbers, though theirs looked somehow older, more tarnished. I knocked and waited, knocked again. No answer. Peering through the front window revealed darkness beyond sheer curtains. "You won't find anyone there," a voice said behind me. I turned to find a woman in her 60s watching from the sidewalk, a small dog tugging at its leash. She introduced herself as Mrs. Chen from across the street and explained she'd been living in the neighborhood for 20 years. "That side's been empty since I moved here," she said, studying my face carefully. "Owners had trouble renting it out. Something about the history." When I described the nightly sounds, the music, the conversations, the rhythmic thumping, her expression shifted from polite interest to something approaching concern. She asked detailed questions. What kind of music? What time did it start? Had I heard other sounds, perhaps during the day? "You should talk to Mrs. Kowalski," she finally suggested, pointing to a house 2 blocks down. "She owns both sides. Been trying to rent that unit for years." Mrs. Kowalski was a small Polish woman who invited me into her kitchen and served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. When I explained my situation, describing my neighbor's evening routine, her face went pale. "You hear music from the 40s?" she asked, her accent thick with worry. "Conversation, 2 people, and the rocking?" I nodded, and she excused herself, returning with a yellowed photo album. The pictures she showed me were from the 1980s. A young couple standing in front of the duplex's other side, the man in his 30s with a neat mustache, the woman pregnant and smiling. Their living room was visible through an open door behind them, featuring a rocking chair near what would be the shared wall. "The Hendersons," Mrs. Kowalski explained. "They lived there from 1985 to 1987. Nice people. He was a mechanic. She was expecting their first. They loved old music, had quite a collection of records." She flipped through more photos, showing me the couple at various stages. Him working on a car in the driveway, her in the garden, both of them painting what appeared to be a nursery. In every image, they looked happy, settled, planning for the future. "What happened to them?" I asked, though something in her expression already suggested the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "House fire in March 1987, she said quietly. Electrical problem, they think. Started in the basement and spread fast. They got out, but the damage was extensive. Had to gut the whole side. By the time I finished the renovation, they'd moved away. Never saw them again. I walked home that evening with questions multiplying in my mind. If the Hendersons had survived and moved away, who did I hear each night? Mrs. Kowalski's renovation would have included new wiring, new walls, new everything. There was no logical reason for sounds to carry from an empty unit. That night I positioned myself near the shared wall at 9:30, waiting. At exactly 10 o'clock, the music began, a Glenn Miller tune I recognized from the albums my grandfather used to play. I pressed my ear to the wall and could swear I heard not just the music but the crackle of vinyl, the occasional skip of a worn record. The conversation started around 10:30. Two voices, one deeper than the other, moving through what sounded like domestic routine. I caught fragments. Something about work, about preparations, about expectations for the future. The woman's voice carried a particular warmth, the kind reserved for intimate moments between partners. Then came the sound I'd been dreading, rhythmic creaking from what could only be a rocking chair, positioned directly against the shared wall. The motion continued for nearly an hour, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, occasionally stopping before resuming with renewed vigor. I placed my palm flat against the wall and jerked it back immediately. The surface was hot enough to be uncomfortable, as if a furnace were running just on the other side. But Mrs. Kowalski had said the unit was empty, unheated, hadn't been occupied in years. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the sounds, feeling the wall's unnatural warmth, trying to rationalize what couldn't be rationalized. Perhaps old buildings held acoustical memories, sound waves trapped in wood and plaster. Perhaps my own stress was manifesting in auditory hallucinations. Perhaps the isolation of living alone was affecting my perception. But the heat was real. I'd measured it with a kitchen thermometer, 78 degrees when the rest of the wall read 62. I'd checked for heating vents, for pipes, for any mechanical explanation. Nothing. The sounds began changing in the fourth week. The music grew louder, more insistent. The conversations became animated, sometimes urgent. The rocking chair's rhythm turned erratic, desperate. And underneath it all, a new sound emerged. A repetitive scratching, like fingernails against wood. I called Mrs. Kowalski and asked if I could see inside the other unit. She agreed reluctantly, warning me that the space hadn't been properly maintained and might not be safe to enter. We met the next morning, and she unlocked the door with obvious reluctance. The interior was nothing like mine. Where my side felt warm and lived in, this felt abandoned, forgotten. Dust covered every surface, and the air held that particular staleness of closed spaces. But the layout was identical. Living room, kitchen, stairs leading to two bedrooms. In the living room, positioned exactly where the sound suggested, sat a rocking chair. The wood was old, darkened with age, the cushions faded and worn. I approached it carefully, noting the way it faced the shared wall, the shallow groove worn into the floor from decades of rocking motion. That was theirs, Mrs. Kowalski said softly. The Hendersons. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away after the fire. Seemed wrong somehow. I touched the chair's arm and felt the same unnatural warmth I'd been experiencing through the wall. The wood was hot, as if someone had been sitting there moments before. Mrs. Kowalski noticed my reaction and backed toward the door. "We should leave," she said, her voice tight with something approaching fear. But I was studying the wall now, the shared barrier between my bedroom and this empty space. The paint was newer than the rest of the room, obviously applied during the post-fire renovation. Yet along the baseboard, I could see darker patches, stains that had bled through multiple coats of primer. "Mrs. Kowalski," I said, not turning from the wall. "You said they got out safely. The Hendersons. You said they moved away." The silence stretched long enough that I finally turned to look at her. Her face had gone white, and she was gripping the doorframe with both hands. "I lied," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I thought if I told the truth you'd move out, and I need the rental income. But I can't keep doing this to people." The room seemed to grow colder as she continued, though the wall against my back still radiated that impossible heat. They didn't get out. The fire moved too fast, trapped them upstairs. She was 8 months pregnant. They found them in the bedroom, right there where you sleep. He was holding her, protecting her from the smoke and flames. The baby died with them. I stared at her, processing the implications. If the Hendersons had died in 1987, what did that make the sounds I'd been hearing for weeks? What did that make the conversations, the music, the rocking chair that seemed to move by itself in this empty room? The other tenants, Mrs. Kowalski said, tears streaming down her face. They all heard them too. The music, the conversations, the rocking. And they all described the same thing you told me. The exact routine, the same songs, the same warmth in the wall. How could you know about their music collection? How could you know about the rocking chair? You described their evening routine perfectly, down to the times. I turned back to the wall, placing both palms against its surface. The heat was intense now, almost burning. Through the plaster I could feel vibrations. Not sound, but actual movement, as if someone were pressing back from the other side. I see them sometimes, Mrs. Kowalski continued, her voice barely audible. Late at night when I drive past, shadows in the windows, the glow of lamplight from inside. I tell myself it's imagination, but the electric company confirms it. No power has been connected to this unit in over a decade. The wall under my hands pulsed with warmth, and for a moment I could swear I felt the rhythm of a heartbeat. Or perhaps two heartbeats, synchronized, eternal, trapped in the space between what was and what is. I pulled my hands away and back toward the door, where Mrs. Kowalski waited with obvious relief. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look around the room. The rocking chair sat motionless, but I could see the indentation in its cushion, as if someone had just stood up. And in the growing shadows of late afternoon, the air near the shared wall seemed to shimmer with warmth and possibility. That night, I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds, the music, the conversation, the rhythmic rocking that would continue until dawn. But now I understood what I was hearing. Not echoes or hallucinations, but the preserved moments of two people who had loved each other, planned a future together, and never had the chance to see it through. The wall grew warm against my back, and I closed my eyes, letting their evening routine wash over me. Somewhere in the space between sleep and waking, I began to wonder, if I could hear them so clearly, could they hear me too? And if they could, what did they make of this stranger who'd moved into their mirror image life, sleeping where they had slept, living where they had died? I never found answers to those questions, but I stopped looking for logical explanations and started accepting the gift they'd given me, the knowledge that love could transcend the boundaries between life and whatever comes after, that some bonds are strong enough to warm walls and play eternal music in empty rooms. 3 months later, when Sarah finally joined me, she noticed the sounds immediately. But by then, I'd learned to think of them not as haunting, but as company. The Hendersons had found a way to continue their evening routine, their quiet domesticity, their preparations for a future that would never arrive but somehow persisted anyway. And on the coldest nights, when the heating bill was too high and the radiators couldn't quite push back the Portland chill, I'd press my hand to that shared wall and feel grateful for the warmth they provided. Two souls keeping each other company across the veil, proving that some things are stronger than fire, stronger than time, stronger than the final darkness that claims us all. Story 10. The keys felt heavier than they should have in my palm, their brass surface already warm from nervous handling. Mrs. Chen had pressed them into my hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, muttering something about the previous tenant leaving suddenly. The hallway of what had once been Chen's boarding house stretched before me, wallpaper curling at the seams like dried skin, releasing the musty perfume of decades. "Room 3B, third floor," she'd said, though the brass numbers on the doors seemed to follow no logical sequence. I passed 7A, then 2C, then something that looked like 15, but might have been 1S in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. The floorboards announced each step with a groan that seemed to echo longer than it should, as if the sound were traveling through more space than the narrow corridor contained. When I finally found my door, the key turned with surprising ease, and I stepped into what would become my obsession. The room was larger than expected. Not luxurious, but spacious enough that the rent Mrs. Chen quoted seemed almost reasonable. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through windows that faced west, casting everything in amber, but it was the doors that caught my attention. 3 of them, in addition to the entrance. One led to what appeared to be a closet, another to a bathroom, and the third... I tried the third door. It opened onto a different bathroom entirely. Larger, with vintage fixtures and hexagonal tile that definitely hadn't been there when I'd glanced through the second door moments before. My first thought was that I'd miscounted the doors. Old buildings often had strange layouts, rooms carved up and reconfigured over decades of use. I closed the door and tried again, making sure I was turning the same brass handle. The larger bathroom materialized again, complete with a clawfoot tub that gleamed despite a thin film of dust. I stood there for several minutes, hand still on the doorknob, feeling the kind of dizziness that comes with staring too long at optical illusions. The rational part of my mind began crafting explanations. Maybe the door led to a shared bathroom. Maybe I'd opened the wrong door entirely. But my fingers knew the truth of the handle they'd grasped twice now, and my feet hadn't moved from their position beside my unopened suitcase. That first week, I told myself I was imagining things. The stress of moving, of starting over in a new city, of living alone for the first time in years, all perfectly reasonable causes for minor spatial confusion. I arranged my few belongings with deliberate care, establishing routines that would anchor me to reality. Coffee at 7 a.m., shower at 7:30, check email at 8. Normal things in normal sequence, but the doors wouldn't cooperate with normal. The closet, when opened with my left hand, contained a narrow space barely wide enough for a few shirts. Opened with my right hand, it stretched back into shadows that my phone's flashlight couldn't quite penetrate, filled with clothing that definitely wasn't mine. Suits from decades past, dresses with shoulder pads, shoes with pointed toes and strange clasps. I began keeping notes, as if documentation might impose order on chaos. Left hand, small closet. Right hand, deep closet with vintage clothes. Morning, bathroom with modern fixtures. Evening, bathroom with clawfoot tub. The patterns shifted, evolved, defied every system I tried to impose. By the second week, I'd filled a notebook with maps and diagrams that looked like the work of someone losing his mind. Room 3B had become a nexus, a point where space folded in on itself in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to visualize it. The rational voice in my head grew quieter each day, drowned out by the compulsive need to understand, to map every possible combination. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening when I tried opening the main door to the hallway with both hands simultaneously, an awkward maneuver that required positioning myself at an angle and pulling with all 10 fingers wrapped around the handle. The hallway that materialized wasn't the one I'd walked through for 2 weeks. This one stretched both directions into darkness that seemed absolute, punctuated only by doors bearing numbers I couldn't quite read. The carpet beneath my feet felt different, thicker, somehow older. The air carried the scent of something floral and cloying, like funeral flowers. I let the door close and stood with my back against it, notebook pressed to my chest like a shield. My breathing sounded too loud in the sudden silence, each exhale seeming to hang in the air longer than physics would allow. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the center of my room with all the lights on, watching the doors as if they might move when I wasn't looking. Around 3 a.m. I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the hallway I knew, but the other one, the one filled with darkness and wrong numbers. The sound was muffled, as if the walker wore slippers or moved through deep carpet. but it stopped directly outside my door and remained there until dawn. The discovery of the ruined house came 3 days later. I'd been experimenting with different combinations, which hand to use, how many fingers, the angle of approach. The notebook had grown thick with observations that read like the ravings of someone deep in psychosis. But when I opened the bathroom door while humming a half-remembered song from childhood, everything changed. Instead of either bathroom, the door opened onto devastation. The room beyond was unmistakably my room, but rotted. The wallpaper hung in strips like shed skin, revealing wood so water-damaged it seemed to pulse with decay. Furniture sat in the same positions but transformed. My desk sagged under the weight of accumulated moisture, my bed frame warped into impossible angles. The air that rushed past me carried the smell of mold and something else, something sweet and wrong that made my stomach lurch. But it was the mirror that broke me, at least temporarily. My reflection stared back from the ruined bathroom beyond, but wrong. Older, wearing clothes I didn't recognize, with an expression of such profound sadness that I slammed the door and backed away, knocking over my chair in the process. I called in sick to work the next day, and the day after that. The apartment had become a puzzle that demanded solution, each door a piece that needed to fit properly in my understanding of reality. I mapped the variations obsessively, filling pages with diagrams that would have looked like abstract art to anyone else. Small bathroom, left hand, morning, whistling. Large bathroom, right hand, evening, silence. Ruined bathroom, both hands, humming, Tuesday, Thursday only. Deep closet, right hand after 6 p.m. Narrow closet, left hand before noon. Vintage closet, both hands, eyes closed. The list grew longer each day, incorporating variables I hadn't considered. The weather, my mood, what I'd eaten for breakfast. The apartment responded to everything, as if it were alive and learning my habits. It was while crouched under my desk, trying to retrieve a pen that had rolled into the shadows, that my fingers found the loose floorboard. The wood lifted easily, revealing a space that shouldn't have existed, too deep for the building's structure, lined with oiled paper that crackled like autumn leaves. The journal inside bore a name I didn't recognize in handwriting that seemed to shift and crawl in the lamplight. Theodore Ashford, architect and engineer, 1923. The pages were filled with sketches and calculations, diagrams of impossible geometries that hurt to look at directly. The problem, read one entry, is not one of space, but of perception. Mrs. Chen's request to house 40 boarders in a building suited for 20 requires creative interpretation of dimensional limitations. The solution lies not in expansion, but in folding, allowing the same space to exist in multiple configurations simultaneously. My hands shook as I turned pages filled with mathematical formulas that resembled no geometry I'd ever studied. Ashford wrote about dimensional flexibility and perceptual anchoring, about creating rooms that could be different things to different people at different times. The human mind, he observed in spidery script, insists on linear spatial relationships, but space itself has no such limitations. A room can be both large and small, both luxurious and decrepit, both occupied and empty. The key is allowing the observer to determine which reality they experience through the simple act of intention. The final entries grew increasingly erratic, filled with observations that made my skin crawl. Ashford wrote about unintended configurations and spaces that shouldn't exist. He mentioned seeing other versions of himself in rooms that defied his careful calculations, versions that seemed stuck in configurations he couldn't map or control. The house, read the last legible entry, has begun to dream. I spent the next week testing Ashford's theories, approaching each door with specific intentions, trying to will particular configurations into existence. The results were inconsistent but undeniable. The apartment responded to expectation, to desire, to fear. When I opened the main door expecting to find Mrs. Chen's familiar hallway, it appeared exactly as I remembered. When I opened it while thinking about the dark corridor with wrong numbers, that nightmare space materialized instead. But increasingly, the apartment seemed to choose its own configurations, presenting me with rooms I hadn't intended, combinations that didn't match my notes. The luxurious version appeared on a Sunday morning when I was thinking about coffee and opened what I thought was the closet door. Instead of hanging clothes, I found a sitting room that belonged in some upscale hotel. Leather furniture, crystal decanters, windows that looked out onto city views I'd never seen before. The air smelled of expensive cologne and something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. I wasn't alone in that room. Something sat in the leather chair facing away from me. Something with shoulders too broad and a neck that bent at an angle that suggested it was listening. I couldn't see its face, couldn't even be certain it had one, but I felt its attention like pressure against my skin. I closed the door quickly, but not before I heard it begin to turn. That night, I dreamed of walking through endless versions of my room. Some clean, some dirty, some filled with furniture I'd never owned, others completely empty except for doors that led to more rooms. In the dream, I passed mirrors that showed different reflections, windows that looked out onto seasons that couldn't exist simultaneously, doors that opened onto rooms I was already standing in. I woke to find my notebook filled with handwriting that looked like mine but described rooms I'd never seen, maps of configurations I'd never tested. The ink was still wet. The breaking point came on a Wednesday when I found myself. I'd been approaching the doors with increasing desperation, trying combinations that grew more elaborate and nonsensical. The apartment felt larger now, as if my mapping had somehow expanded its boundaries rather than defining them. Sounds carried differently. My footsteps echoed from directions that shouldn't exist, and sometimes I heard my own voice calling from rooms I wasn't in. When I opened the bathroom door that afternoon, I found the ruined version again. But this time I forced myself to look longer, to really see what lay beyond the decay. The mirror still showed my reflection, but now I could see behind it, into the room where that other version of me stood. He was facing away, looking at his own mirror, but his posture was wrong, too rigid, too still. His clothes were different, older, as if he'd been there for months or years. When he began to turn, I saw that his face was mine but changed, marked by an expression of such desperate hunger that I stumbled backward. But this time, the door wouldn't close. My other self stepped toward the barrier between us, and I realized he was mouthing words. It took several seconds to understand what he was saying, to read the shape of lips that mirrored my own. Let me out. I pressed my full weight against the door, but it resisted as if something were pushing from the other side. Through the gap, I could see more figures moving in the ruined room, other versions of myself, all wearing different clothes, all with that same desperate expression. They moved like sleepwalkers, converging on the doorway with slow, inevitable purpose. The door finally slammed shut, but I could hear them on the other side, pressing against the barrier, their voices barely audible through the wood. They were all speaking in unison, all saying the same thing. Let us out. Let us out. Let us out. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The sounds continued intermittently. Footsteps, voices, the soft thudding of palms against wood. During the day, the doors returned to their normal variations, but I could feel something watching from within each configuration, waiting. Today marks 2 weeks since I found Ashford's journal. I've stopped leaving the apartment entirely, sustaining myself on delivery food, and the growing certainty that I understand what's happening. The building isn't just folded space, it's a trap, a maze designed to create infinite variations of the same prison. But understanding doesn't equal escape. As I write this, sitting in the center of my room with my back to all the doors, I can hear movement in the walls themselves. Not footsteps in adjacent rooms, but actual movement within the structure, as if something large were shifting behind the wallpaper. The sound suggests space where none should exist, dimensions that extend beyond what the building's external walls could contain. I've stopped mapping the door combinations. The notebook lies abandoned beside Ashford's journal, both documents serving as evidence of obsessions that solved nothing. Instead, I've been watching the mirrors, studying the reflections that show rooms I'm not in, versions of myself I've never been. The truth is becoming clear, though I resist accepting it fully. The apartment doesn't just contain multiple configurations. It contains multiple mes, each trapped in their own version of this space, each believing they're the real one. The original one. The one who moved in 2 weeks ago with a suitcase and a desperate need for affordable housing. But which version am I? The question hangs in the air like the scent of those funeral flowers, unanswerable and terrifying. When I look in my bathroom mirror now, I sometimes see movement behind my reflection. Other versions of this room where other versions of myself are writing in notebooks, mapping doors, reading journals left by architects who thought they could outsmart the fundamental nature of space. We're all real. We're all trapped. And somewhere in the folded geometry of this place, Mrs. Chen continues to collect rent from tenants who don't realize they're sharing the same room with themselves, existing in parallel configurations that never quite touch. The doors are quiet now, but I know they're waiting. Each handle promises escape, promises a way back to the linear world where space behaves properly, and rooms contain only what they appear to contain. But I've learned not to trust promises made by brass and wood. Tomorrow, I think I'll try opening all the doors simultaneously. I want to see what happens when every configuration exists at once, when all the folded spaces unfold and reveal the true structure of this place. Maybe I'll find a way out. Maybe I'll find something worse. Maybe I'll find out which version of me is writing this, and which ones are just reading it, trapped in their own notebooks, in their own rooms, in their own versions of a building that should not exist. The keys feel heavier now than they did that first day, weighted with possibilities I never wanted to discover, but I'm going to use them anyway, because the alternative is sitting here forever, wondering which reality is real, which doors lead home, and whether home even exists anymore in a world where space folds in on itself and architects dream buildings into existence. The sound of footsteps has started again, but this time they're coming from every direction at once, as if all the other versions of myself have finally decided to move in unison. They're getting closer, and I think they want to compare notes. I think they want to know which one of us gets to leave. Story 11. The floorboards in the attic groaned under my weight like arthritic joints, each step announcing my presence to whatever might be listening in the darkness above. I'd been putting off this exploration for 3 weeks since moving into the Victorian house on Elm Street, but the persistent scratching sounds from overhead had finally driven me up here with nothing but a flashlight and my professional camera bag. As a freelance photographer, I'd always been drawn to abandoned places, forgotten corners where stories lingered in the dust. But this attic felt different. The air hung thick and stagnant, carrying an underlying sweetness that reminded me uncomfortably of flowers left too long in a vase. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing stacks of cardboard boxes, a rocking horse with paint peeling from its wooden flanks, and in the far corner, an ornate trunk that seemed to absorb rather than reflect my light. The trunk's brass hinges protested as I lifted the lid, releasing a stronger wave of that cloying floral scent. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, lay dozens of photographs, not snapshots or casual family pictures, but formal portraits, the kind people commission for special occasions or to mark important moments. The subjects were dressed in clothing that spanned decades, from Victorian formal wear to more recent styles from the 1980s and 90s. I lifted the first photograph, a sepia-toned portrait of a young woman in a high-collared dress. Her eyes held a peculiar intensity, as if she were looking not at the camera, but through it, directly at me. The photographer in me appreciated the composition and lighting, though something about the image made my skin crawl. I set it aside and examined the next. A family of 4 from what appeared to be the 1950s, all dressed in their Sunday best, smiling with the forced cheer typical of formal portraits. But as I studied the image more closely, something was wrong. The father's hairline seemed higher than it should be for someone who appeared to be in his 30s. The mother's hands, clasped in her lap, showed liver spots that seemed too prominent for her youthful face. The inconsistencies were subtle but undeniable, like looking at someone wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. I spent the next hour cataloging the photographs, laying them out on the attic floor in chronological order based on clothing and photographic style. With each image, the same unsettling pattern emerged. The subjects appeared to be aging inconsistently. Faces that should have been young bore the weight of years, while others seemed frozen in time, untouched by the passage of decades. The scratching sound came again, more insistent now, seeming to emanate from within the walls themselves. I followed the noise to the opposite corner of the attic, where my flashlight revealed something I'd initially missed: a small wooden easel holding a single photograph. Unlike the formal portraits in the trunk, this was a Polaroid, the kind that develops instantly. The image showed the attic exactly as it appeared now, complete with the scattered photographs on the floor and my camera bag sitting where I'd left it. But I hadn't taken this picture. My hands trembled as I picked up the Polaroid. The image was clear and sharp, showing every detail of the scene before me with perfect accuracy, except for one thing. In the photograph, I wasn't there. Despite being taken from an angle that should have included me